Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. What I want to talk about in this session is I was in two minds. I was thinking, do I start off with a discussion of Fazl Rahman and Iqbal, or do I start off with a conversation about the question of modernity? And I thought, originally I wanted to start off with the kind of Muslim thinkers and engagement, but I thought maybe start off with kind of a few kind of opening remarks regarding the question of modernity. When someone says modern and modernity and modernization, what comes to mind? Why don't you do me a favor? Just write down what comes to mind. I don't want your answers right now. Just make some notes for yourself, what you think it is, because we'll come back to that. Some keynotes, keywords. What do you think about that? I think most Muslims, when they encounter this question of modernity and modern, most Muslim thinkers particularly think about it as something to do with the secularism, and with secularism immediately the thought that comes to mind is atheism. That seems to be the kind of anxiety that surrounds the idea of modern and modernity. But I think the genealogy of modernity is much more complex and detailed, and it requires, there's been a tremendous amount of study. I would recommend to you an article that I found very helpful by Dipesh Chakrabarty on the muddle of modernity, American Historical Review. And he cites a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine at Duke University, John Richards, who had passed on. John and I were quite close, and John wrote that between 1500 and 1800, human society shared and were affected by several worldwide processes of change that were unprecedented in their scope and identity. And therefore he calls that 1500 to 1800 the early modern period. And there's been a whole lot of debate among South Asian scholars and scholars of the Middle East. When is the late modern? When is the early modern? When does modernity really begin? And so on. And for Richards, there were at least 6 distinct but complementary large-scale processes that defined the early modern period. Yahya, would you be so kind to be the eminences and jot down some things? My handwriting is not terribly bad. And I think I sound better if I stand here. I don't know if that's a marker, but okay. So the first thing is that, number one, is that these 6 large processes were, number one, global sea passages that led Europeans to exploration, mapping, and reporting. Exploration, mapping, and reporting. The second is the rise of a truly global world economy. That's the second. The third is the growth. The third is the growth of large, stable states and other large-scale complex organizations. Number 4 is the doubling of the world population. And 5, the intensified use of land, involving, and that use of land involved the displacement and destruction of indigenous societies. And 6, that's fine, that's just fine. And 6 is diffusion of several new technologies. And by that he means new world crops, so crops from the new world, gunpowder, printing, and then also massive organizational responses to these things. This is broadly the kinds of issues that we go through, that historians think about how the debate about what constitutes the modern. So here you can see global sea passages, a global world economy. So it's a very different way of understanding it. Martin Heidegger thinks about these issues in terms of what he calls the making of a world picture. The making of a world. The modern condition is of a world picture, that you can have a picture of the world in a very kind of different way. The picture of the world. And he thinks that for Heidegger, of course, this picture of the world, the making of the world picture, as you call it, the making of the world picture is not a good thing for him, because he thinks ultimately it should lead to, he thinks that, and he prefers that it would lead to poetry. That the modern world, instead of the world picture, would lead to poetry, and poetry will open you up to being, that you will be able to understand being, wujud. And everybody understand what I'm saying? It opens up to being. So poetry, Heidegger's view is that the question of picture is not too good, but he does a dispassionate analysis of that, and for him that is the kind of way in which he sees things, or analyzes things, but he's not happy with that. Now, oftentimes we use Immanuel Wallerstein. Might have heard of that name. For Wallerstein, there's kind of distinction between modernization and modernity. Modernization is, in Wallerstein's view, the triumph of humankind over nature. How do you think that happens? Through technology, right? The triumph of humankind over nature, the rise of technology. The ability to predict weather patterns, the ability to begin to planning in advance, how to eliminate disease, certain kinds, and so on. So technological, nowadays we can, bulldoze entire mountains in order to flatten the land, do all kinds of things, and so on. I wasn't going to go there, but there you go. And the second one is the triumph of humankind over itself. What do we mean by that? The triumph of humankind over itself. By that we mean that, at least in some ways, against oppressive human privilege, that is, to overcome that, oppressive human authority, to resist that, to resist political tyranny, clerical bigotry, and economic servitude, right? So those ways in which people think of themselves as modern, that they've overcome certain forms of oppressive governance and forms of domination. Now, all this tells you that this question, and there's a lot more detail, and I don't want to go further fine-tuned because some of you might be saying, now where's the Islam part in all this? I'm sure you're going there, and this guy doesn't have his coffee done yet, and so is he talking sense or not? I believe me that the whole idea is this question of, a part of the modernity story is that of self-reflexivity. Self-reflexivity, how we become self-reflexive, and how we be able to think about ourselves. Now this is, so some people talk about that we think about ourselves as modern, to think of yourself as modern. You think of yourself as modern, to have a view of yourself. To have a particular view of yourself as modern. Now, many people argue that this idea, clearly this is a huge program. So people might say, now what about the entrepot cities in the Indian Ocean between Shanghai, what's the name, in the Chinese coast and all the way down India. Wasn't there global traffic and so on? There was some kind of traffic and so on. There was this sea, kind of sea traffic. But to think of a kind of a global world economy of resources and the movement of resources over large spaces and so on, the development of large stable states, doubling of world population, land use, these come into existence only at a particular time in our known history. So, and that begins to make a new kind of human, a new kind of human being, a human being that thinks of him or herself, mostly himself. Afterwards they included herself. But they thought of themselves in a particular way to make that. Because it started off in a very kind of patriarchal way. I mean, the history of colonialism, is it Lord Cromer, who was so opposed to women's rights in the UK, but had a lot to say about how he thinks about changing the natives and so on. And so even someone like C.A. Bailey, in The Birth of the Modern World, 1780 to 1914, he talks about that the rise of the nation state, the massive expansion of global links, industrialization, urbanization, and the like signaled changes that were so rapid that they constituted a step change in human social organization and could thus be seen as constituting the birth of the modern world. Now, you see, one of the things that we fail to understand is how we are made by the world around us. We often think that we are in control of the world. But oftentimes, technologies and other things control us. We are controlled. If you think about the use of memory at a particular time, then the use of print, and the rise of writing. And the rise of writing, how then books occupy us rather than, books now make us instead of we writing books. Actually, books write us, right? The way in which we are situated globally and the movement of people, the kinds of exchange, the kind of expectations we have as a result of urbanization, massive global developments, all these things bring about alteration in our self-construction, self-conception, self-making. And that is a very vital part that we need to understand. So we have inherited, for instance, teachings and practices of ritual, customs and values and so on, that come from a time in which the nature of the human self was differently constituted. I don't want to say different human nature, but was differently constituted. The things around them, around those humans in 7th century Arabia, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, the things around them made different kinds of human beings. They had different kinds of expectations. They had different kinds of relationalities between men and women, between men and women and slaves, between believers and unbelievers, between ruler and subjects. A whole set of different expectations. One of the big flaws that we have in Islamic thought, that people say, hey, Muslims had shura in the Prophet's time. They did consult. Hey, that is so close to democracy. It is also yeah, it's a very thin kind of but that idea of shura and consultation happens in a very different milieu. The hierarchies are very different. You're talking about, if I tell any one of you, hey, just come, do something, go and polish my shoes or do something for me because I'm your professor here today, you're going to say, jump in a lake, right? You don't have that kind of expectations. But if you had but many of you are still caught up by old style charisma. Is a very charismatic person coming here, of a very kind of old style. All of you will flock to kiss his hand or her hand or whatever the case may be. And, so that comes from a different kind of throwback of a different kind of authority. But generally, by and large, we have very different kinds of expectations of each other because we are made in a different way. We are constituted differently. We think about fairness, egalitarianism, justice, those kinds of questions to be, and justice and fairness in a non-hierarchical manner. We think of it in an egalitarian manner. Just that idea to move from hierarchy to egalitarianism in the very idea of justice and fairness is a huge step change in self-imagination. Therefore, it's so ironic that when people want to use, for instance, the Prophet's alayhi salam's final sermon, where he says, all of you are children of Adam. La farqa bayna Arabiyyin wa Ajamiyyin. Okay? No difference between the Arab and the non-Arab. And you're all like the teeth of a comb. I don't know what kind of comb he had, because normally you have combs, you have the big teeth and the small teeth. So that might be slightly different. I don't know. I don't understand the imagery, and I don't know what the 7th century Arabian comb looked like. So if someone, archaeologist, some paleontologist helps me to figure out how that comb looks, I can have a better sense. But I got no idea. But the kind of combs I've been exposed to is that, but I think the indication that the teeth of the comb are all kind of in a straight line. But nowadays you get combs that come with slight angle, or the teeth are getting smaller, or they get tighter, whatever the case may be. But oftentimes Muslims want to use that and say, hey, we have equality, the Prophet said so. But he says it against a backdrop of a slave society, of a slave-holding society. Of course, he wants to end slavery, generally says, be kind to your slaves, and talks to men and said, you must really take care of your women, and they are very entrusted to you, and talks to women and said, really, you need to be loyal to your husbands and so on, and anybody you should bow down to and prostrate to should be to your husbands. I know most women will find that very problematic, but the great Prophet said so. I take it within a particular historical context, right? But it might feel very difficult for many people today that how can a woman want to prostrate in front of a man? He said, if it was permissible. So it's a kind of a make-believe. All I'm saying here is that those kinds of statements must be taken within a particular historical context. This idea that we start rereading that statement as kind of egalitarianism of the order that we now experience, given that what we have gone through, and political, economic, and urbanization processes and so on, we now superimpose upon those early teachings our imagination. But it's unlikely that was what was imagined in the 7th century. It's unlikely, highly unlikely. But unless you think that history is a fiction and you can just make it up as you go along, then that's a different story. So I think this is possibly the one part of what I'm going to say about the kind of material transformations. It's material transformations that also transforms the self. Now, the other part that I want to share with you is an author that not too many people read, but it's Leszek Kolakowski. K-O, right over there. Leszek, L-E-S-E-K. Sorry, L-E-S-Z-K. L-E-S. Yeah, K-O-L-A. K-O-L-A.
Oh, sorry.
L-A, there we go. Kowski, yeah. Leszek, L-E-S-Z-E-K. Z.
Oh, Z-E-K.
Yeah, or Z.
See, Polish is the second biggest language in Britain now, and I still can't.
Yeah, and I'm using an Americanism, Z instead of Z. Yeah, okay. Too bad. See, that's what also happens. You live in different countries, you pick up different kinds of accents, you're totally confused. All right. And he has a very important book called Modernity on Endless Trial. And Kolakowski actually just died last year. It's an unsung hero, very insightful individual. Anybody familiar with his work? Yeah.
Wasn't he somebody who was exiled from Poland for being very critical of communism and
Right. He was here in London. He was here in London and moved between London and Chicago. He taught at Chicago. He was very critical of what's in it. So he problematizes modernity for me in a slightly different way, as opposed to kind of the political economy interpretations of how modernity. This is the kind of political economy. This is more kind of a understanding of kind of a sociological notion here, but his is more kind of philosophical. So he thinks that the idea of change, he thinks that the very idea of change. So first of all, this idea of change is obviously always a problem for us, but the very idea that no age can conceptually identify itself, is capable of conceptually identifying itself. This idea of conceptually identifying itself is always something that happens after the fact. But we ourselves cannot identify ourselves conceptually. Right? Because it takes a long duration to first make the stuff of who we are stable before we can say that. But we can periodically look back and say where we were, how we've come there. And of course that, when we look at the morphology of civilizations, when we look at the things out of which civilizations are made out of, the constituent parts of it, we call it the morphology of it. It's very controversial and is loaded with ideological biases. How you read history, how you explain Islamic civilization. Remember? And just explain Western civilization, very, very biased, because it's always in service of some kind of triumphant project. Right? So Muslims think about, the rise of the Rashidun Caliphate, the pious caliphate. Then think about, okay, everything went down in a civil war. Then it all went further down with the Umayyads, because they turned it from a kind of a rustic, very basic, primitive caliphate into something called kingship. Then you had the Abbasids that came. Of course, they did good things, but they continued this kind of Persian idea that the king is some kind of divine avatar, right? That the caliph is some kind of divine avatar, the mixing of Persian thought and so on, and all the kind of things. But then this idea that, the goodness that Muslim civilization brought, Western civilization thinks of itself in the same way, that modernity could only be possible in the womb of a Christian civilization, because Christianity has a certain notion of immanence, right? And Christianity, that the immanence of divine in the world creates a certain kind of possibility, a creativity, that it can create a certain kind of rupture between the past and the present, and a certain kind of newness that emerges. So that's a kind of another way of theologically thinking about modernity from a Western Christian perspective and so on. But that's not the only one. But come back to Kolakowski. Kolakowski is very crucial in trying to understand that, some of these issues, the clash between, as he says, between the ancient and the modern, is probably everlasting, and we will never get rid of it, as it expresses the natural tension between structure and evolution. And then this tension seems to be, he says, biologically rooted between structure and evolution. We may believe an essential characteristic of life, and therefore we go through forces of conservation in society and forces of, dissolution, ruptures, continuity and discontinuity. We also have the element of curiosity. And he says that curiosity is both in terms of, what happened to our forefathers in paradise, the sin of curiosity, because they were curious what was, not to eat the forbidden apple or pick from the forbidden tree. And so in that way, curiosity is the thing of the calamities that befalls human beings, but also unquestionably have been the source of some of our greatest achievements, curiosity. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. And therefore people think that, some of these risks are not are not to be taken, more conservative elements would say. And so there's something unique that Kolakowski talks about, that, you know, that the Greek, Latin, Judaic and Christian sources were uniquely successful in promoting and spreading a rapid and accelerating changes in science, technology, art, and social order. Whereas many other cultures survived in fairly stagnant conditions, with barely noticeable changes. And so there is this question, why did it happen? And he says that there are no good answers to that. There are no really good answers why this happens in some and not in others. And what these changes happen in different societies because of the accumulation of demographic factors, economic factors, linguistic, climatic, all those kind of factors that come together. So someone like Ibn Khaldun, for instance, understands some of these issues very clearly. So he talks about kind of Imran, you know, what we call urbanization, talks about the Badu, the people who are in the kind of non-urban areas, the sedentary people, nomadic peoples. He thinks about what kind of changes happens within people living in larger demographic spaces and conceptions of self, how they then construct for them knowledge patterns, and they construct for them ideas about what knowledge is because of who and what they are, how knowledge transforms itself from a rural to a rural setting to an urban setting. So Ibn Khaldun and other Muslim thinkers are aware of that and so on. Finally, I think that the key thing that many argue, that the foundation of modernity is in science, especially from the first half of the 17th century, when the basic rules of scientific inquiry were elaborated and codified. That the rules of scientific inquiry having this kind of particular order, but not only based, that physics was not only based from a certain kind of experience that you had, but rather that you start building abstract models in laboratories, and that these abstract models, for instance, would never be perfectly replicated in experimentation, but you work with those kind of models. But the key thing that I think most people will recognize is what happens as a result of a number of changes is the emancipation of what we call secular reason from revelation. That secular reason separates from revelation, and the kind of struggle of independence of different kinds of faculties of learning within universities in Europe from the grip hold of theology. So you know the stuff that happens to Galileo and other major Bruno, Giordano Bruno and others, because of their kind of scientific probings and so on. Because of the grip hold of theology. And that's the most significant thing that happens. And the distinction between natural knowledge and divinely inspired knowledge. And that becomes the kind of the conceptual foundation of the struggle between the modern and its adversaries. And one of the things that spooks Kolakowski is that he's bothered by the idea that the notion of taboo, the notion of good and bad, might be at threat in the modern. The idea of good and bad might be eliminated through process of secular rationality that he finds particularly threatening and that makes human life meaningless and brings you to the precipice of nihilism. Now, most Muslims are worried about that. Whenever you read modernity and stuff, the diatribes of Muslims are all always about, oh, the destruction of the good, there's no good and bad is going to remain, and so on. I think it's overdone, it's over-exaggerated. These kind of transformations and so on are completely ignored in the analytic by Muslims about these things, and they just get hung on to the good and the bad, and certain kind of anxiety, whereas in fact most people living under the modern conditions and so on are becoming also deeply religious. I mean, religion is not going away under the modern period. In fact, amongst Muslim moderns, religion is increasing. So Kolakowski is talking about a certain kind of European experience where churches are emptying out, but people are getting into, I don't think he's looked at these things, but evangelical movements are on the rise in Christianity, Judaism. In Africa, Christian evangelicals are on the rise in Ghana and Nigeria. It's huge. But this is the philosophical concern that modernity can threaten these kinds of notions of the good and the bad, and the destruction of the notion of taboo. And he thinks that Nietzsche was the real culprit of this. That he thinks that Nietzsche, that when all this was happening, this idea that this self-aware secularity, the erosion of faith, and the educated classes advancing themselves, that these were all kinds of unavoidable things. The invasion of rationalism by a number of logical devices. So what happens is that faith could, at least in some ways, preserve itself in one spot, whereas rationality and its work and science continued and so on. And people, for generations, people could live in these two incompatible worlds, the secular and the world of faith. It was a thin shell that protected this faith, the thin shell. So they could have this confidence in faith, but also progress of science and technology that went on side by side, and modern technology. But as Kolakowski says, the shell was, to quote him, the shell was eventually to be broken. And this was ultimately done by Nietzsche's noisy philosophical hammer. I keep on quoting him now. His destructive passion brought havoc into the seeming spiritual safety of the middle classes and demolished what he believed was the bad faith of those who refused to be witnesses to the death of God. He was successful in passionately attacking the spurious mental security of people who failed to realize what really happened, because it was he who said everything to the end. The world generates no meaning, no distinction between good and evil. Reality is pointless, and there is no other hidden reality behind it. The world as we see it is the ultimum. It does not try to convey a message to us. It does not refer to anything else. It is self-exhausting and deaf-mute. All this had to be said, and Nietzsche found a solution, or a medicine for the despair. This solution was madness. Not much could have been said after him on the lines he had laid out. End of quote. I think we need to think about what is going on here. That Nietzsche understands that the world has changed so much, this understanding of the self, these massive things. And he was an alert spirit, and I will tell you later on about Iqbal and Nietzsche, because how Iqbal thought that Nietzsche got it. Nietzsche got it. So Nietzsche understands this, the conception, because the world around us has changed and our theologies was embedded in a world from of a different era, a different surround, Our theologies were made in a different surround. The surround has massively changed. Right now, we are in a very different surround. We are now in the Anthropocene moment, right? We are now in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene means that we are now totally dependent on the environment. Our future is totally dependent on the amount of greenhouse gases and others that we're releasing, our food and nourishment sources. Everything is now, we're in a very different space, but we will come back to that. But Nietzsche, at least in the 19th century, understood these issues in a particular way, and he said, that conception of God that we have, that God is dead. Remember, as he says in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when he meets the guy and he says, but doesn't he know that God is dead? Nietzsche is not atheistic, as people say today. He's deeply troubled by, where is the God? I need a God. I need something. I need something of ultimum. So most people think that Nietzsche is kind of he's struggling with faith. He's struggling with something much more deeper. And so he said, God is dead. And you saw the bumper stickers, people said, yeah, Nietzsche said, God is dead. Nietzsche is dead. Remember that one? Yeah. So that's kind of a crude joke, kind of meaningless, and totally misunderstands what Nietzsche is saying, right? But it is that, how do we make meaning in the world? What does this reality around us tell us? Now I say, quickly Muslims are going to come up and say, hey, the Quran says, look in nature. Hal tara min futur. Nature is very consistent. It has an order. It has a meaning. Nietzsche, unfortunately, did not look. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about nature. He's talking about something way beyond. Of course, he can understand if he's theistic, that nature, where does nature. But it's a whole different story now, because, the Darwinian revolution of how we think about the origins of the world, how this comes about. We now think about, the last couple of months I've been kind of bothered by stuff I'm doing on questions of reading more up on science and neuroscience and those kind of issues. My mind boggles when I don't know why I realized that at age 56. But every star up in the sky is part of is the sun of a massive galaxy. A galaxy, and there's gazillions of those stuff up there. I don't know, I can't get my head around this stuff. Every damn star up there is a galaxy of some sort. And so what is this fuss about that we're making about ourselves out here? We are kind of, and now the hadith that says that, this world in the eyes of God is less than the significance of a wing of a mosquito, makes eminent sense. We just way too self-obsessed about ourselves. And Muslims are triply obsessed about themselves. They got a big obsession problem. They're usually obsessed about themselves, as if they are God's only creation. Abu Tammam, a great Muslim poet, talks about, and I think this applies to us. He specifically wrote it for the Muslims of the 21st century. وَكَأَنَّ رَبَّكَ لَمْ يَخْلُقْ لِخَشْيَتِهِ سِوَاهُمْ فِي جَمِيعِ النَّاسِ إِنسَانًا. That as if your Lord did not create out of all his creation, except these lot, to reverence him. Right? Except this lot to reverence him. Not you guys, but I just mean us, including. So this kind of self-importance that we give to ourselves and so on. But isn't this mind-boggling, that this whole thing of this cosmos that we're just discovering the edges of it now? When I grew up, there was a planet called Pluto. Pluto is gone. It's something else. Right? This thing advances and expands all the time. We come to the edges of it, and now this is mind-boggling stuff. This is the stuff. And where do we come from? How do we get here? What is our place? What is our role? Those old cosmologies that on which our faith traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even Hinduism, Buddhism, others were based on, are based on different kinds of cosmologies. This is a a radically different cosmology. Now we have to make sense of those teachings in this context. And how do we translate these teachings in this context? This is the big question. Translation, folks. Translation, translation, translation. That is the key thing. How do you translate this stuff? Because you've got things that are born in a very different womb. This is a small story, yes. This is a small story of 400-500 years on the globe. This is a very small story. And Islam is a baby religion compared to Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism. We are babies. We're only around 1400 years. That's in the history. This is nothing. It's a baby. We're still babies. 1400 years in the history of a religion, we're possibly just beginning to walk. You understand what I'm saying? We're just beginning to walk. So we ought not to think that, it's a long way to go still. And hopefully, if we get it right, we can play a different role. But I think we need to begin thinking of these issues in the longer durée. Pardon me?
That's if we say that Islam is solely founded by Muhammad and not the religion of our forefathers before Muhammad.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about Islam ala Muhammad. I'm thinking of Islam as a tradition brought by the Prophet Muhammad and the teachings, right? That I'm talking about that trajectory. Yeah, Islam with a small I goes long way, but that's a more of a kind of a philosophical one. I'm talking about a historical tradition. See what I'm saying? I'm not talking about a metaphysical, theological tradition. So I'm talking about that in a more kind of mundane context. And even then, even just for the sake of argument, what is the oldest religion? How can we date the oldest religions? Amongst the Judeo-Christian ones is Judaism, right? 6,000 years, 7,000 years of Judaism, incarnation of a certain kind of monotheism. Most Muslim theologians are not going to accept native Indian traditions, which was kind of incarnationist and panentheistic. They'll see that as what's in it. But let's take that. In the 4.5 billion years or 4.3 billion years history of understanding of where we come from, 10, 20, even a million years is a short time. So I don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about, a religion of our forefathers. We're talking about then the history of monotheism. See what I'm saying? Are you talking about the history of monotheism, or are you talking about what religions? So we may need to think about this in the kind of a broad perspective.
You remove the boundaries of religion in that, in defining religion in terms where it has boundaries and
Right.
a particular definition, then yeah, we're stuck with this. This is a formalized religion.
Right.
But if we open it up,
Right.
we look at the Quranic narrative on Adam, and Adam being a subservient servant of God,
Right.
then that's subservience to God's command and nature is what essentially deen is.
Yeah, but how old is that Adam?
Well, that's the origins of man.
Right.
As far as we are.
Yeah. No, where is that, right? But how far back do we go with that? But that's also kind of a understanding of man without a ways in which we can talk sensibly about that man. We can only then talk about that man in a theological faith way. Right? We cannot talk about man in a historical way, in that sense.
Nor can we talk about anything else in that.
Yeah, but we can talk about today we are. That's a key thing. Today we are constituted by history, and Islam is one of those religions born in the bright lights of history. Right? I mean, there's more documentation that there was a person called Muhammad around, in the 7th century there is about anything about Moses or Jesus, right? For that matter. And even if you say, well, you know, some people are pushing the kind of historiography, say might have been, some of these stories look very much like what's happened 150 years later. Granted, okay, let's for argument's sake accept it. It's still within the bright lights of history. Right? It is within documented, what we take to be reliable memory. But we can take that conversation further. Let me conclude, because you need some coffee and rest, and that is that. And so, one of the ways in which the modern has dealt with the questions of authority, the questions of on the political front, the question of the body and science and nature and so on, has ushered in a whole different way in which we now relate to nature, relate to ourselves and our bodies. Transplantation, you can now give parts of your body to someone else as an act of altruism. Is that an act of altruism? Is that acting like, you know, in an offensive metaphysical way? All these issues raise a number of deeply philosophically problematic questions about who we are and what we are. And so it raises kind of questions of, you know, on the one hand, there was this challenge that would we be able to have a harmonious alloy or synthesis, on the one hand, between the modern factory and the Athenian agora, the place of learning. And somehow these would merge into one. How this changes our vocabularies of how we talk about ourselves. But has it now become that we are now completely controlled by a vast bureaucratic machinery, what Max Weber talked about, right? The iron cage of modernity, and a certain kind of rationality, that we are now imprisoned by that. Somehow we become prisoners of that, and that we really no longer assent to that. So there's some amount of pushback to this idea of modernity, that we become its prisoners rather than its masters. That we thought we mastered nature, we thought we did that, but just the reverse has happened. And so it raises a whole number of questions, and people of religious faith are possibly wanting to go back to this question of how can one have faith. So, you know, faith in one side, have that shell, and let science and technology do it. But now what has been happening is that many are beginning to say that no, this faith tradition, this kind of pristine faith of a particular time and a moment in history, can be a corrective to the world. That it can correct the world, it can alter those passions, those forces, those energies can. So for instance, in 1979, when I was in my 20s and so on, we were all very excited about the Islamic revolution in Iran. We thought that it's going to be a time in which, first of all, it was a big kind of boost to people of faith, that people of faith can begin to take charge of their lives and order the world according to a religious theological template. This is our big moment. Right? It was like the Cuban Revolution for Muslims. It was like Khomeini was our Che Guevara. Right? Suddenly the Muslims had what the left always had, right? These kind of But just this dude wore a turban, and he was doer, and he was kind of, he was kind of a different kind of guy. But that was a big moment. It was political excitement. What couldn't happen in Egypt, where people were thrown in jails. Gaddafi duped people with, the green book, and King Faisal turned down the taps of oil to the west and momentarily sent shockwaves through it, but said, we're not going to let people mess around with us from Saudi Arabia, and the Muslims are going to take charge of the world, and they want some fair treatment, but that was only temporary. But here came Khomeini and so on, and so there was this big excitement of what's going to happen, and be a corrective of society. And that was in 79, 89, 99, 2009. What are we now? It's 34 years, 33 years of the Iranian Revolution.
It's coming up, I guess, in this month.
In February, right? It comes up, as I think, 5th of February. And so I mean, it's a monumental disaster for some. Others who would benefit from it think it's changed the world for them. Of course, it shifted the balance of power. It gives uphill to a very aggressive and arrogant European and North American powers. Yes, it does that. But, are these Pyrrhic victories? Does the life condition change? Has it become a model to be imitated elsewhere? Big questions around it. And the theological project has really been horrendous. I mean, the theological project has been horrendous. And this kind of corrective. Or the folks who, okay, so you might say those are the Shias, they're kind of, okay, they're not the cool guys. The Sunnis in Egypt, I mean, 5 minutes of power, they go for the power grab and completely splash the whole situation in Egypt, that no one trusts them anymore, right? The Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi, and so on. So all these kind of questions raises big kind of issues about the place of religion and in the context of modernity. But I think what I was just trying to inject into the conversation, in the next session I'll talk more in detail about Iqbal and Fazl Rahman Fazl Rahman, Iqbal and Shah Waliullah, and how I think this question of social change in the modern, at least to my mind, works, and kind of thoughts and questions that we have that I need to share with you. We can talk more about, but I wanted to put this template on the table because I think this is the thing that drives it. This is the thing that drives it, and some of those other questions, the philosophical question, drives these kinds of anxieties and passions that go around it. And I think it's very, very, very crucial that we ponder this in a careful way. So the session is Sharia and history. So I think most of you know that my work. I'm constantly agonizing about how does a tradition translate itself under new conditions. We can keep that. It's fine. I don't need to take it off right now. How does a tradition sustain itself under these kinds of conditions? A tradition that we've inherited, that's been manufactured, composed within a different set of historical conditions. And so I think of these issues a great deal, and it has agonized me for a long time. So, for instance, I remember that the very first kinds of think questions, once I began to find that I'm attracted to religion, or religion started inspiring me at a very young age, made me question a whole lot of things and so on. I remember I read Maududi's book, Islamic Law and Constitutionalism. And I remember that Maududi was very strong on the application of Islamic law and the criminal penalties and the hudud, and that people's hands need to be amputated or people need to be flogged. And I found it tremendously difficult to understand. How could a God require that? How could a God require that human hands have to be amputated? It's still a issue for me, still not resolved. I have ways of getting around it, but I've thought about those issues and the question of the hudud and these Islamic criminal penalties, and the way in what people call Sharia and so on. And I have to think about what is the place of those kinds of teachings within the development of the tradition. Now I know there are people going to say, and you've been all taught that you have to surrender completely to what God and the Prophet had brought. What's the verse? وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا لِمُؤْمِنَةٍ أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمْ خِيَرَةٌ فِيمَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَن يُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. Right? What's that verse? Was the Hufaz here? Was the Hafiz here? That the believing men and women don't have the choice but to surrender what God and His Prophet has brought. That's what you've been taught. So what is this kind of questioning about these teachings? But it is precisely what I've talked about earlier, is that we have been altered. We no longer believe in violence to the body. Yes, we drop F-16s and bodies being destroyed. You're going to tell me all about the kind of horrendous things that are happening in the world. But yet we still find that to be, therefore we are so strongly opposed to those kind of things. Precisely because we don't believe human bodies have to be destroyed. Whether the Americans do it, or Saddam Hussein did it, or anybody else does it, or Khomeini does it, we are opposed to that. We have a particular kind of sensitivity. We have been altered by the conditions, by the surround, but we don't find that tolerable. We don't find it as a manifestation of human dignity. So we go with all kinds of trickery, all kinds of apologetics, and say, actually, we really don't have to. Sharia doesn't mean that. Sharia doesn't mean the hudud from day one. It means about justice and about fairness and about distribution. Only if you have optimal conditions, then can you cut off people's hands. Right? That's the way we go about it. But even if you have optimal conditions and one person steals, are we going to cut off their hands? Is there other ways that we can punish them without cutting off their hands? If people engage in sexual offenses, yeah, we know that the death penalty is if you do it flagrante delicto in public, 4 people must witness the act, blah, 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 so it's impossible to punish and so on and so forth. So you're going to have all kinds of ways that you're going to delay the implementation of that, and you're going to postpone the utopia for that, and you're going to go through all mental gymnastics to address these kind of issues and say, no, 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 no. But we're really basically being ostrich-like and putting our heads in the sand, and we're not understanding how this tradition, how does it go, how does it work? What did Muslim thinkers how did they think about these issues? So it is about some very fundamental issues that we haven't come to grips with. So it's what I call, traditions in the making. And now, obviously, there are some very bright people in this room, and they're going to say, see, you've now become subject to a Western form of subjectivity. I'm not going to mention Omar's name, because not him. I'm not referring to him. But see that, and that's what happened. That's what happens to Muslim professors. They study in the West. They read too much Nietzsche. They start questioning Islam, and this is what happens. See, this is what is wrong with Islam. Brother, what you should do is to wear a longer beard. You should remember the Sunnah. You should do all this kind of stuff, and then you'll be a Pakka Muslim. Okay. Thank you for the advice. Okay.
I don't think you should.
No, I'm not talking about Omar. No, Omar, please.
Most of those things didn't come from me.
Omar, I'm not talking to you.
A changed sensibility is no basis for a sort of. What if that changed sensibility isn't global?
Yeah, no. I'll come to that. You're going to have a job. You're going to be first to ask questions. Okay. But generally, that is the kind of Muslim attack. Is that this comes from outside of us. This doesn't come from Muslim tradition. This kind of interrogation is not ours. And there we become victims to it. And in the communities that I studied in the madrasas of South Asia. All my teachers and other people, their main thing is Maghrib se mar'oob ho gaye. Maghrib se mar'oob, yani you become intimidated by the force of the West. Maududi, Abul Hasan al-Nadwi, all those Sayyid Qutb, all those kind of folks and so on, they have the same thing, that people are bewitched by modernity. And this bewitchedness has completely screwed up Muslim DNA, religious DNA and everything else and so on, and therefore they are what they are, right? And so then the response has been the kind of the uber orthodoxy, right? Or this kind of enlightened traditionalism, right? That, hate the Enlightenment is the enemy, but meanwhile we can live in Europe and we can have, organic chickens and we can have organic foods and we can do this kind of stuff, or you can have the other kind of Islamic traditionalism, which is kind of, the metaphysical Disney world of Sayyid Hussein Nasr. That metaphysics is that you have to go back to this cosmology that is the post-Darwinian one, the Copernican, Keplerian, now it's post kind of NASA kind of cosmology that we have is all kind of empirical, is completely horrendous, is a fracture of nature. René Guénon said, this is the what they call it, the sinful, no, sign of times, and this is basically the fallen period and so on. So you have to go back to a cosmology of Mullah Sadra and so on. Well, good luck. My thing is just good luck. So my position is that of a realist. Okay, I'm a realist. I do have ideals too. I do have ideals, but I have to deal with the reality in front of me. I have to deal with Muslim powerlessness. I have to deal with the anxiety of children who needs to have a future. I need to have a think about a ummah that needs to prosper and must see less of its children killed and see less of it do self-destruct. And I want it to have a place on the globe and a future for itself. Those are my aspirations. That is my community. And I, in some ways, represent a sliver of that community. I don't represent all of them and so on. I want women to have a respectable status in their society. I want children to have a respectable status in that society. I want men to have a respectable status. I want all the kind of good things for them. I want khair and goodness and so on and so forth that the ummah should have. We can do it with a scarf, without a scarf. You can do it with a beard, without a beard. Those kind of stuff are now really passé. Those are not the big issues anymore. These are identitarian issues, but identity is only so thin and so thick. There are deeper things to identity than the beard and the scarf. And so I'm not mocking those and so on. Feel free to wear as many layers of a scarf, as long a beard as you want to wear. I just want beauty. For me, it's aesthetics. Ultimately, all this is about aesthetics. And I think that one of the things that we need to pay attention to is aesthetics, is beauty in Muslim life. But that's a side story. The more fundamental stuff is this question here of how do we deal with reality. So of course there's a massive critique of modernity, right? I've just rehearsed it with you about separation of reason from revelation, and can you put this back together again? How do you organize? Can you bring revelation, back into reason? And what is that going to look like? Can it be done artificially? Can we just in a Muslim lab sit and put it together? Can we just do it together through Muslim life and think this is going to be a model? It's much more. That is way too simplistic to think about it. So Islamization of Knowledge project of Ismail Farouqi and others and so on was about that kind of thing of putting some Islamic DNA into science and social science, and putting some social science and scientific thinking into religious thinking, and hoping that the thing will solve itself. I think my view is that we need to play the knowledge game as it is played. There's the rules of the game of the knowledge game. We are heirs to multiple civilizational riches. As Muslims, and I particularly talk about a Muslim living in the West. And sometimes we cannot pay too much attention of Muslims living in the West, because their conditions are very different. We cannot dictate to them. We cannot, advocate for them. And yes, some of the stuff they do there comes through our windows and splashes in our faces because we have historical connections. But at some point we'll have to pull down close down the windows and say, hey, I'm not responsible for what goes on in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Palestine or other places and so on. As much as I care about that, you cannot now come and destroy my world here for me. because I'm trying to live as a citizen of the United States or Canada or Britain or France and so on. I want to make a life here for me. And some of these issues are problematic. Yes, we can send out our armies of missionaries who are going to help those societies, and we need to create this kind of boundaries here, the media and others. We are British Muslims, or we are European Muslims, we are North American Muslims and so on, and we take responsibility for what we do, but we can't be responsible for what people do elsewhere, right? So that's one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that we need to think about, so we need to play the knowledge game in our context. And this knowledge game here, there's rules of the game, there are traditions here, so we are heirs of both the Western tradition and multiple Eastern traditions. If you're historical Islamic tradition, if you're African, you have an African tradition. If you are South Asian, you have the South Asian subculture. You're Arab, you have the Arab sub-traditions and so on. So you're heirs of that. And how does one, standing in, and I'll talk later about that, but having, that is your richness, that you have this history of the multiple richness of these multiple civilization experiences that you can bring into the conversation and contribute to the struggle of human beings on this part, in this continent. So the question of interpretation is central to this whole thing. So I think it's a hermeneutical project. The project is hermeneutical. It's about interpretation. But the hermeneutics is just not about trying to connect the dots between one verse and another verse, or this set of hadith, prophetic, with that set of hadith and creating that. But hermeneutics also involves the self and the world. You are interpreting with your feet on the ground. You're not interpreting from Mars. Even on Mars, there might be some form of gravity. Or even if you're on the moon, there might be no gravity or very weak gravity and you'll be floating, but there's going to be some pull at some point. So you're standing in the world, you're interpreting from a particular space, and you're making the world. And that is part of your interpretive process. So for instance, when the Prophet tells the companions, Sallul Asr fi Bani Qurayza, pray the Asr prayers with the Banu Qurayza, they travel, Asr time comes. Some of them say, hey, we need to pray Asr. Some say, no, the Prophet said we must go there. People speaking the same language, in the same milieu, same kind of family, they hear the message differently. Because they world differently. They are worldly in different ways. Each one of them are constituted slightly different, even in the same continuous culture. If I say now, let's go out and have lunch, some of you are going to come back in an hour's time, some of you are going to say 1 hour, 15 minutes, you're going to come back, each one's going to hear slightly differently. Some of you are going to hear that Moosa said, going to eat vegetarian lunch. Some are going to say, no, have a non-veg. You're going to have all kinds of different interpretations because we are worlded different, we are made up differently. Even though we're all going to leave at the same door, once we get out of the door, we're going to do different things. So it's a question of interpretation because it involves our subjectivity and all the kind of background that we have. So on the question of Sharia, Muslims always say that deen, so I don't translate deen as religion. Because the word religion is a very kind of modern understanding. And when you think about religion, you think about the public and the private, right? Religion is a kind of private practice. But deen is what I think as salvation practices. So deen is those practices that you do that you have to do in order to give you salvation in the afterlife. There's at least a core of those that you have to do in Islam, right? The 5 pillars, confession and the rituals that you have to do. Those, at least the minimum, gets you into the salvation game, right? Those are the rules of the game. That's the salvation. Then you can, now the question about, and Islam and Muslim thinkers talk about deen and dunya, right? The worldliness. And always the Quran gives you teachings about, to the extent, وَلَا تَنْسَ نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, and don't forget your share of the world. So there seems to be a kind of salvation through the world. in the world, through your worldly encounter, you're going to have salvation. It's not, I mean, while it might have differences, some people might say that Islam allows for some amount of people to be monastics and to be world abnegating and world denying and so on and so forth. There might be some place for that, but everybody's not required to do so. Some people have to charge their battery so they can do so, but most of us have to do our normal thing and live the normal lives. We have to take care of our families. We have to act responsibly and deal with the world. So deen and the question of dunya. So at the time of empire, when Islam was empire, because Islam inherits the political order of pre-existing political orders. It's Byzantine and Persian. So Islam fits in, as Muslims today fit into democracy, or try to fit in and make it work and revamp it and retool it, and so they came in when they come into power and they get into big power games and so on. The whole game changes. When Omar meets Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, when he meets Muawiyah in Damascus, and he sees Muawiyah wearing different kinds of attire, he said, "Hey Muawiyah, what's up? What's up with this?" He didn't say it like that. He said, "What's this you dress? What's this you're wearing?" So Muawiyah says to him, "Listen, if I don't wear like this, these folks here are not going to take me seriously. This is the kind of mantelpieces they have to wear, the regalia I have to wear, because these people here are accustomed to this kind of authority." So Umar said, "La amruka wa la anhak." I don't encourage you to do this, I also don't forbid you to do this. So Umar said, well, this is not something. But Umar is the biggest kind of figure in Islamic thought. It was quite interesting. Maybe he didn't like Muawiyah's kind of, pomp and splendor. But Umar was one of those people that did the most of adaptation of Islamic norms and practices to new circumstances. Shibli Nomani wrote a whole book on Umar and Umar's applications of thought and so on. It's worthwhile reading that. And many people think of Umar as a kind of a great kind of legislative figure who talks about maslahah and the public good and how the public good is reordered in the world. Okay, so Umar makes kind of major amendments to several questions. Remember, the famous story of Umar is that in the year of famine, where people were engaged in high rates of and large numbers of people were engaged in acts of criminality and stealing, Umar suspends the amputation of hands. Well, the biggest thing is that the question of spoils of war, generally, the fighters would get a share of it. Whether it is, whether through armed force that they conquer territories or whether they peacefully conquer territories, spoils of war given to the fighters. That was okay when they were like fighting fellow tribes and you get the camels and the odd pieces of, utensils and so on, you distribute it, and furs and sheepskins and those kind of stuff. These are easy to divide. When they get into Egypt and Iraq, where they're now getting to urban centers and so on, suddenly these fighters are going, yay, yippee, we're now going to be overnight, we're going to inherit this big building and this piece of land. Omar said, wait a minute, that's not going to happen here. They're getting all mad with him. He said, no, I'm going to give you guys a stipend from the Baitul Mal, from the state treasury. You're going to get a stipend. You guys can become salaried army, but you're not going to take other people's land. And they quoting him back verses of the Quran and so on. Verses of the Quran says the Prophet gets us people who fight, and said, no, listen, this is going to be the thing. This is going to be the rules. This is going to be the rule. So the Quran says something in the Umar understands that's it. So early Muslim jurists like Shafi has a huge headache of trying to interpret this, because they now have to interpret Umar's interpretation of that. Explicit Quranic verses saying that it must be given to the fighters. Shafi then said, well, all these fighters, they consented to Umar's actions. Of course, they didn't have much choice. Umar is the prince of the believers. He's the commander-in-chief. He calls the shots. He calls the shots because he knows what is in the best public good. See what I'm saying? So public good prevails. rather than the fine print of the text. The public good prevails. So therefore Omar is such a smart figure in history. Also, one of the only figures in Islamic of the caliphs who comes warts and all, right? Omar has very complex personality. He's the guy who beats up his sister when she converts, and he's getting crazy at the time when he wasn't there. And then he's the one who challenges the Prophet several times also on some of the things. So he becomes a full-blooded figure. He's a great figure. He's someone one can identify with. Anyway, so this question of deen, Muslims think of deen, salvation being a universal practice, but the engagement with norms and values over time, shariahs, they are different and they change over time. Right? Isn't that the kind of thinking Muslims generally talk about? Shariahs are eternal. Deen is eternal. Deen is God's message to humanity over time. Back to your question, whenever that humanity started, there's deen. People must make a compact with heaven. There must be that debt that they live towards. But this question of norms and values, they change with the change in time and place. How these norms and values, they are different in different places. For the Hebrews was different. For the Assyrians was different. For the ancient Egyptians different. These are all context-based. So Sharia is something that changes over time, over the long durée of history. So there's a Muhammadan Sharia. There's a Muhammadan Sharia, the Sharia Muhammadiyah, that comes in the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And what does the Shara mean? Shara means that which has been brought, that which has been revealed. Now the key question here is that most people think that what is revealed means it has to be implemented. What is revealed means automatically, especially in this Protestant Islam that most Muslims practice today, they only want to follow their Quran, and every word in the Quran has to be implemented, right? See, I'm critical of that. You already get that? Yeah. So every word must be implemented. Otherwise, we're going to go, be destroyed the way Christians and Jews have been destroyed. So we have to do this. That's the kind of thing we have in our minds, but it's not true. So we think that that's the way to do it. Key question is, that's not the way Muslims historically thought about these issues. Every verse in the Quran was not actionable. Packages of verses are actionable. Different kind of verses are connected, different kind of dots are created between verses that makes it a package of meaning. Therefore, you have 5 surviving law schools who package these verses and prophetic statements in different packages. They come up with different, slightly marginal different packages. There were other law schools too, different kind of packages. So first lesson, every verse is not actionable in itself, it is interpretable. It comes in packages, clusters. Some of them are lower down in the cluster, others on top. And these things change and alter over time and the way interpreters go. So this idea of Sharia as a trodden path and so on is a trodden path of norms and values, path to water as literally it means, and so on and so forth. But these consist of a whole package of practices, both individual and communitarian and so on. So here's the thing. How did Muslims think about these issues over time? For me, one of the most inspiring things that I've read is Shah Waliullah, a man who dies in 1762 in India. He's written a book called God's Conclusive Proof, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, the conclusive proof of God. It's a very important writing. He's a very deep thinker. And in his book, he has I see some of these authors also write things and they plant time bombs. They put things there and they hide it away as a time bomb, hoping it will explode later. So he writes, now Waliullah is very important. Waliullah, despite Muslims in South Asia differing amongst themselves, they are Deobandi and the Barelvis and Ahl Hadith and so on, all of them love Waliullah. Because Waliullah inspired, and the Muslim modernists, they all look at Waliullah as an inspiration. each one takes a different piece of waliullah. Here's the piece of waliullah that I think we need to pay attention to. So waliullah in his book, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, God's conclusive proof, he puts it in the form of a hypothetical. A hypothetical. So the prophet that comes at a particular time and place, and this prophet has to cater to its community, to his community. So he says, what this prophet needs is a set of rules and regulations to order that community. He needs a qanun, he needs the rules, he needs a shariah. Then he says, what has to happen, what ideally should happen, he puts it, is that all the different tribes and communities to whom this prophet, to whom he addresses and to whom he delivers the heavenly message, the rules and regulations should be the average rules amongst them, amongst their customs. It must be based on their custom, on their adat. See, because if I'm going to tell you, let's work here, and I'm going to work with you on the customs of Mars or Indonesia, not going to work for you. You're going to say, what are you talking about? Where are you coming from? Right? Same, it's a very practical thing. The rules and regulations are practical things. They're customs. So the prophet ideally comes to deal with the average customs of all the different communities. But then he says the prophet has a problem because all these communities don't come and join him on day one. This tribe joins now, then it takes 10 years before another one comes. And meanwhile, the prophet has to get on to mobilizing and making a community. So what the prophet then does, he starts with the customs of his own community as the standard. This is sociology of Islamic law. Start with their own community, and then basically makes that the axis around which all the other communities begin to formulate their practices. Now he says, but he quickly realizes, Waliullah realizes, that in communities where these customs are more or less acceptable, this thing is going to work. Because the Sharia is based on customs. Our Sharia is based on Arab custom. Our Sharia is based on Arab custom. You look at the book of fiqh on zakat, it's all about camels and sheep and animals and so on. Now, when the interpreters of Sharia moved to Persia and Iraq and so on, they now deal with new cases and they include and so on and so forth. Now they have to expand this whole thing. Therefore, the biggest contribution Muslims make is to the kind of legal edifice of understanding this fiqh and the Sharia, fiqh/Sharia, whatever, how we use it and so on. They do that. But Waliullah understands that this stuff is going to be a problem because people who don't share these customs, how are they going to feel connected to this stuff? So then he makes this very powerful statement. He says, there's nothing more perfect and more convenient than the Prophet giving consideration to the custom of his people to whom he had been dispatched in matters related to religious. That he must be more perfect and convenient than the Prophet giving consideration to the custom of his people to whom he had been dispatched, that he must give them some slack, he must cut them some slack in matters related to one. Can you just make a note of that? Religious symbols. You must cut them some slack in the religious symbols. In penalties, in hudud, he used the word. And in matters related to the civilizing process. Civilizing process, he used the word irtifaqat. He used matters related to the civilizing process. Irtifaqat means those things that makes life convenient for you, that gives you rifq. Can you just translate that word irtifaqat? Irtifaqat means those things that makes things easy for you, convenient for you. Taysir. That's what the civilizing process is also about. How do you make things easy? How do you take technology? Remember we talked about technology subduing nature, to make things easy, to bring convenience, to to store food instead of getting hungry every 6 weeks. Seasonal food, these are all part of irtifaqat, what we call organization, creating. That's what Waliullah means. He calls it irtifaqat, but we call bureaucracy, public organization. That's what he means. How do you make life convenient? Okay, so sha'air, he calls that. He says in the matters of sha'air. Another one he says in the matters of hudud, and in matters of irtifaqat, must cut them slack. Let me give you the what's the name?
Do you have the reference even for that?
Yeah, it's in volume. I don't have Marcia Hermansen has translated that, but in the Arabic version is volume 1, page 338, and I think I've used the Palampuri edition, Sayyid Ahmad Palampuri's reference. It's called. Let me just give you a. Okay, I think I think it's. I used the edition of what it shows. So it's volume 1. It's in the section on. It's not the section called. باب في دين ينسخ الأديان. In the section on the deen that abrogates all other deens. That's the section. I can find it to you if you have.
I've got it. Yeah.
Okay, I can find it for you there. Okay, so let me just get back. Let me just get to a text and then. فلا أحسن ولا أيسر من أن يعتبر في الشعائر والحدود والارتفاقات عادة قومه المبعوث فيهم. That in the matters, there's nothing better for the prophet, for the hypothetical prophet, nothing better, nothing more nicer, more perfect, ahsan, more beautiful, ولا أيسر, nothing more easier for him, for the Prophet, that in the matters of sha'air, of religious symbols, in the questions of hudud and irtifaqat, and those questions of civilizing process, that he must follow the ada of the people, the custom of the people to whom he had been dispatched. Now comes the crucial. Now you must know, he's writing this in an environment that if he makes a misstep, everybody's going to jump on him, right? So he's been highly circumspect how he puts this. Now he says, ولا يضيق كل التضييق على الآخرين الذين يأتون بعد. And he says that you must not. Let me get back to my translation. Be easier rather than doing on-the-spot translation. And then he says that. Neither should later followers be coerced. Instead, they should receive overall compassionate consideration. The later followers should not be coerced. Instead, they should receive overall compassionate consideration. He says, for the early followers, adhere to these norms, to the shari'ah, by virtue of the testimony of their hearts, since it accords with their customs. So the earliest community who follow these rules, these customs, it's normal for them. It fulfills with the testimony of their heart. It's like nothing to them.
Sorry, what rules?
The rules of the Sharia, the Shira.
Yeah, but what is the Sharia that are you referring to? Quran or?
No, in the Prophet's time,
These customs, remember? So he said the Sharia are based on the customs of the people. So for instance, how do they deal with thieves? They cut off thieves' hands. How do they deal in trade and transaction and those kinds of practices?
So those are matters that are explicitly stated in the Quran. If you're accepted it because it was in tune with their custom.
Yeah, he doesn't talk about the Arabs. I said early on, remember he said he makes a hypothetical case. So he talks about a hypothetical prophet. He's talking about sociology. You see, he's making up a sociology. So he's nuancing his argument. So he doesn't mention the Arab prophet. He says, prophets come, and this is what they do. They have to administer rules and regulations for their communities. And these rules and regulations are based on customs. And then he said, these customs, and in another place, in Fuyud al-Haramain, which I just translated this morning at 3 o'clock, he says that wahi and the revelation comes, and it's on the basis of the adat. The revelation is based on the adat, the customs of the Prophet. And then he even goes further and said, these ideas are already, these customary ideas and the words, even the revelation that comes out of the mouth of the Prophet, the alfaz and the kalimat and the asalib are already preserved in the mind of the Prophet. Is already preserved, mahfudun fi dhihn al-nabi. And then it comes out from him. So he actually makes a stronger case that how the mind of the Prophet is attuned to the custom of the people. Already it's embodied, organically linked to the societies. But coming back to this quote in Hujjatullah, so he says that you should not, there is nothing more perfect and convenient than the Prophet giving consideration to the custom of his people, to whom he had been dispatched in matters related to religious symbols, penalties, and matters related to the civilizing process. Neither should later followers be coerced. Instead, they should receive overall compassionate consideration. Now, here is a big point of contention. And the point of contention is about this word, because it says, وَلَا يُضَيِّقُ كُلَّ التَّضْيِيقِ على الآخرين الذين يأتون بعد ويبقي عليهم بالجملة ويبقي عليهم في الجملة. This word, this is a big discussion. So Shibli Nomani was a very, very good reader of text. Shibli Nomani, born in 1857, died in 1914. Very, very prominent Indian thinker, involved in the making of the Nadwat al-Ulama, taught at Aligarh and so on. He brought this up in his book on theology, Kalam or Ilmul Kalam. He raised this question. There's been a number of attempts to rebut, because he latches onto this text of Waliullah. And he said, look, Waliullah is saying, so Shibli has the same kind of concerns that I had I have about how does this Sharia stuff work, right? These are no longer part of our custom. These are customs from an alien land. And you soon see how Waliullah talks about that. So the thing is that this word, yabqa, most people read it as yabqa, but doesn't make sense, because he says you mustn't coerce them, you must give them some slack in these matters. Or you say wa yabqa alayhim fil jumla, and then you must remain on it collectively. Doesn't work. Yabqa is not right. Shibli didn't read like that, but this guy from Gujranwala in Mullah Zahid al-Rashidi's son, Abu Ammar in his Ammar Nasir, who is a very active scholar and one of the serious scholars of Pakistan, young scholar. He has been on this question of blasphemy, raising whole kinds of questions and so on. But even he misreads this text. So he reads it as Yabqa, and he tries to refute Shibli. But Sayyid Ahmad Palampuri, and if you read the Arabic language, and Waliullah used a very, very difficult word here, it actually is Yubqi alayhi fil jumla. Wa yubqi, abqa, yubqi. The fourth form means to be compassionate. Wa yush, to be compassionate. Yani yushfiqu alayhim. Yushfiqu alayhim bil jumla. Yushfiq, ishfaq means to be compassionate. That's what the fourth form, yubqi, abqa, yubqi, then it makes sense. Wa yubqi alayhim fil jumla. And that is how this verse that text makes sense. ويبقي عليهم في الجملة. Then he says الأولون يتيسر لهم الأخذ بتلك الشريعة بشهادة قلوبهم وعاداتهم. That the ancients who follow that tradition, they follow, for the early followers, adhere to these norms by virtue of their testimony of their hearts, since it accords with their customs. وَالْآخَرُونَ, and what does he say? وَالْآخَرُونَ يتيسر لهم ذلك بالرغبة في سير أئمة الملة والخلفاء فإنها كالأمر الطبيعي لكل قوم في كل عصر قديما وحديثا. Then he says, and the later followers, they adhere to it due to a desire to follow the example of the leaders of the community and the rulers. This, he says, is a natural phenomenon for every nation in every age, ancient or modern. So here he's putting into perspective here, and he's saying it in very, very kind of subtle terms, that for later generations these customs might not be. Therefore, says you need to cut them some slack, because what might be a shi'ar, a symbol in one area, might not be a symbol in another area, because these symbols also differ within particular cultures, within a broad community like Muslims. So, for instance, Imam Shatibi, the jurist from 14th century Al-Andalus, says that in the Maghrib, in the western part of the Muslim empire, in the Maghrib, if you don't pray without a cap, it's no big deal. No one is going to say anything to you. But if you don't pray with a cap in the Mashriq, people think that there's something wrong in your faith and your faith testimony. He says that in Muwafaqat. So something like that is seen as a, I don't know how many mosques you've been in. When I pray without it, so many people put the thing on your head. Right? They put a cap on your head while you're praying, they disrupt you. Because they feel so strong about it. Sisters, you don't have that problem. Feel sorry for us. Okay, so so Waliullah gives us a great deal to think about. Great deal to think about these issues, and I think it helps me that I begin to understand that these practices, what is known as Sharia, are customary practices, but he couldn't say that explicitly. Couldn't say that explicitly. Because there's a huge, and even today, you can't say that explicitly. There will be fatwas of takfir, just like that now, coming up. Because they're going to say, you're denying Sharia. Denying Sharia. Because it's the consensus of the community built around the stuff. So what we are doing, we're puncturing that consensus through a certain kind of rationality. Unless you see Waliullah who'd never been to Europe, who'd never read anything of English or of Rousseau or something. He might have read, I think he might have read Bernier. Bernier, the French writer. A lot of his stuff was translated into Persian already. A traveler. He might have read Bernier. He was aware, one of the things Waliullah started thinking about was that he says, so Waliullah is also kind of a Gnostic figure, right? He's also big into Ibn Arabi. So he thinks that, the Afflatus is talking to him. The cosmos is speaking to him. So he says, I was sitting and I had this meditation and this reflection that I saw the grandson of the Prophet coming to me, Hassan and Hussein, Imam Hassan and Hussein radiallahu anhum, coming to me and saying, this is the pen of our grandfather. Right? And then he says that I started realizing that I have to defend the deen on the base of rationality. It's a time of reason that we are into now. It's the age of reason. So he understands the kind of spirit of the times, that the tradition has to be defended in the spirit of reason. So when you read Hujjatul al-Baligha, already in 18th century, and this guy spent 3 years in the Hijaz. He spent 3 years in the Hijaz. He hung around with Shafi and Maliki teachers. And one of the things that he came back to India was that he wanted to abolish the madhabs. But then they realized this will be suicide in India if you're going to say anything about the Hanafis and so on. So what he then does in a large section of the Hujjatul al-Baligha is all about, similar to Shatibi stuff on maqasid, that the objectives of the Sharia are 5: protection of faith, religion, protection of life, protection of reason, protection of property, protection of family. Let's call it is a protection of progeny, but let's call it family, right? You know these 5 protections? Can we just put it down? So he writes about that, and he talks a lot about maslahah. And what I now realize, that he had sight of maybe Shatibi's works already. Or even though Shatibi's works only was read in the Maghrib, in Tunis and those places, and Muhammad Abdu and these people picked up so already in 1860s, 70s, Al-Muwafaqat, which is Shatibi's book. And Muwafaqat means the reconciliation. Muwafaqat means so Shatibi was already attempting in the 14th century a reconciliation between the Maliki school and the Hanafi school. That's what the book is called, Reconciliations. Trying to reconcile 2 schools. Reconcile the Maliki school with the Hanafi school. The Malikis didn't like it. They told him, hey, what's up with you? Malik is good enough for us. And so Shatibi went into, he passed into anonymity. People didn't know who Shatibi was. Very few people in North Africa read him a little bit. And Tahir bin Ashur and those folks also in Tunis and those places were aware of him. And people at the Zaytuna were reading him. And then Muhammad Abdu comes to Tunis. He sees this book and he takes it with him, and he tells Abdullah Daraz, who was an Azhari who studied in Paris, and said, you need to edit this book and write and get it published. And that also helped the Muslim reformers of the 19th and 20th century, like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, their project. And then Shatibi's other book called Al-I'tisam, which is about theology and so on. That book was later on published in the beginning of the 20th century. That's how Shatibi gets. But Waliullah, in my view, has seen these kind of stuff. So this book of his is full of these maqasid and maslahah stuff, that objectives of the law. So this is the thing. And I know you have a question.
I may be misunderstanding you here.
Uh-huh.
Are you suggesting that Waliullah here is not differentiating between Sha'air Allah and Sha'air al-Nas, and he doesn't know Urf and Adat, and he's not differentiating between the two, because you seem to suggest that Adat and Urf is the same thing as the Sharia, whereas the Fuqaha have already dealt with Urf and
Yeah.
the countenance of different
Yeah,
cultures
yeah.
wasn't a new thing for Waliullah. It happened hundreds of years before him. So
Right. Now, I think you need to bracket the fiqh discussion. What he's talking about is a meta conversation. What he's talking about is a meta sociology of the law. You need to bracket out the stuff about the fiqh of the fuqaha talk about the 4 sources, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas, and then the whole thing of the status of urf. I get that, okay? What he's saying, that the very material of revelation is based on, some of the stuff is based on customs. So for instance, the Quran says, jihad and particular ways you do jihad. He says it's based on based on Arab war customs. He's saying the way you deal with hudud, right? Hudud of what later on gets encoded as a hudud of criminal penalties and so on. He said these are based on customary practices. Waliullah say that. But he doesn't address it. I'm now interpreting that. He doesn't address it to the Arab Prophet. He puts it in hypothetical form, remember? He doesn't mention the Arab Prophet. But he's got a whole section talking about the Prophet. I mean, the hypothetical Prophet. And this hypothetical Prophet is the Imam. He's the political leader, okay? So I don't want to put words in Waliullah's mouth.
you're doing that then?
No, I'm interpreting him. This is Ibrahim Moosa speaking.
Waliullah,
So can we? Why don't we?
I'm going to finish that, please.
No, hang on a minute. Who's the chair here? Sorry, are you the chair? Should we swap places?
Mustafa will do the questions and
But he's right. I need to give them some chance for questions. So I think people might be quite pregnant.
It's fair on other people, isn't it? If we
Yeah. No, but I need to. I just need to close up.
close this.
I want to close. I lost my train of thought.
but I would like that discussion, if it's possible, in a short time. Because the discussion about Shah Waliullah is an important one. But I think it remains incomplete without a few comments about the context in which he was operating in the subcontinent at the time. Because I think that's very critical. because the condition, socio-political condition in which he operates is very important and determines a lot of the things he does.
Sure. I mean, even it also further supports my case about the social conditions under which he's operating and so on. But what was that? Where was I heading with this stuff? Shatibi and Waliullah had sight of thought about these issues like Shatibi did, and he spent So he thinks of himself as having a large project that he has to deal with the age of reason, and he has to present the tradition in the language of the time, and he makes this very powerful case of how he talks about this. So I want to be very clear. Waliullah talks about a hypothetical prophet. I'm saying that he's giving me a lot of hints of how I need to operate here, okay, how I can understand him, and I think he's right. He understands the question. Why don't you have a seat?
No, we're going to get the mic.
Oh, okay. Because you intimidate me when you stand. And you know what? Here's the thing. I now understand. First of all, I couldn't understand why Iqbal used to say that there's only one person who could have fixed and who has made some major inroads into Islamic thought, and that's Shah Waliullah. But the more I read this guy, the more I understand this guy had real insights. I might not agree with all of the stuff it said. Like, who agrees with everything everybody says anyway? But Iqbal really got him, and Iqbal makes a big meal out of him, and Iqbal thinks that he got it, and so Waliullah came to India, and he wanted to then change the rules and regulations, and wanted to have a single school. He thought that it was very problematic, and then basically what he says, and one of the big things that Waliullah says, you don't think Muwatta is the most, he doesn't think that Bukhari is the most important book. He thinks the Muwatta of Malik is the most important book. He thinks Malik's Muwatta is more important. So he does begin to see that Malik's kind of very organic understanding of the Sunnah therefore, you see, Malik's understanding of the Sunnah is a very organic version of the Sunnah. It's something that grows. It's the amal of the Ahlul Madinah. So it's not only about the Prophet said and abstracted and locked down. No. It is what the Prophet said and did, and the way it lives out its life post-prophetically. For him, that is also the Sunnah. The post-prophetic life of the Prophet's practice, his utterances and his statements as understood by the community, for Waliullah, that's something that Fazlur Rahman picks up also in his book Islamic Methodology in History, about the amal of the Ahlul Madinah. In that way, he's a Waliullah. He sees Waliullah in that sense, that is the amal of the Ahlul Madinah, that is the living Sunnah. And the big problem comes in with Shafi, because Shafi put everything in lockdown. Shafi said, no, I go to Medina, I see people say this is the Sunnah in this corner of Medina. I go there, they say that is the Sunnah. I go there, they say that. Hey, he says, there's so much confusion here, I need to know what is the real Sunnah. So then Shafi says, okay, I'm going to give it a particular order. Which one comes first, which one comes later, which one has a stronger line of authority, and I'm going to put it into lockdown. And we're going to capture it. What is the Sunnah? That is the Sunnah. So he disagrees with Malik, his teacher, right? So in some way, Shafi puts the Sunnah into lockdown and he puts it into there, but it's now decontextualized. Whereas the Maliki understanding of Sunnah is the living practice. So the Prophet did that. I see the Prophet more or less and I imitate the Prophet. That's also Sunnah. Someone else who is from a different point of view. So it's a much more organic and a living and a dynamic practice. But for Shafi, who was a much more organized and reason-based guy, and he wanted to put everything into systematic, he found that to be problematic. So this is the some of the things that I want to say about the question of the Sharia. The question of Sharia and tradition is, I think that the Sharia is an ongoing project. It's an ongoing project of understanding some of these teachings. Someone like Iqbal, for instance, said something to the effect, nor can concepts of theological systems draped in the terminology of a practically dead metaphysics. Remember I talked about how our world has changed, and that we have a different cosmos and we imagine metaphysics slightly, very differently now because of a changed cosmos. It changed us. Iqbal is alert to this. Iqbal says that we now have a dead metaphysics. Nor can the concepts of theological systems draped in the terminology of a practically dead metaphysics be of any help to those who happen to possess a different intellectual background. Possess a different intellectual background. Page 97, Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. The task before the modern Muslim is therefore immense. He has to rethink the whole system of Islamic thought without completely breaking with the past. Isn't that powerful? He has to rethink the whole system without breaking with the past. That's going to take a lot of work. Perhaps the first Muslim who felt the urge of a new spirit in him was Shah Waliullah of Delhi. The man, however, who fully realized the importance and immensity of the task and whose deep insight into the inner meaning of the history of Muslim thought and life, combined with a broad vision engendered by his wide experience of men and manners, would have made him a living link between the past and the future, was Jamaluddin Afghani. He thinks that Afghani could have done that, but his thing is that Afghani wasted too much time in political activism. If his indefatigable but divided energy could have devoted itself entirely to Islam as a system of human belief and conduct, the world of Islam, intellectually speaking, would have been on a much more solid ground today. Key, without spoil, but here's the alert. Iqbal says, the only course open to us is to approach modern knowledge with a respectful but independent attitude and to appreciate the teachings of Islam in the light of that knowledge, even though we may be led to differ from those who have gone before us. End of quote. Okay. So, I think in some ways, Muhammad Iqbal was perhaps for me a great inspiration. Asked very provocative questions, and but he also, and the other person was Fazlur Rahman. Let me tell you my relationship with Fazlur Rahman. When I graduated from Darul Uloom Nadwatul Ulama, where Sheikh Namazi at the back, Uwais Namazi, also graduated from, and I graduated in 1981. I stuck out, spent 6 years in the subcontinent, wanted to learn Arabic, wanted to know the tradition and so on. I quickly realized that there's going to be very little dividends here, but I need to stick it out. I need to learn the stuff. I need to learn the tools. But I came out of the madrasas and I realized I'm not getting the big picture of stuff. I'm getting all this kind of fiqh stuff. It doesn't really answer my questions. So I started a whole education, a reset button on my education when I come outside the madrasas. I come to the UK, I get a job with Arabia magazine, and I'm right in these neighborhoods here. And I begin to read, and I pick up this book of Fazlur Rahman called Islam, University of Chicago Press. And I read this book, and I said, wow, this guy knows what I know, but he can put it together. There's a storyline here. He talks about the Quran, he talks about the Prophet, he talks about Sharia. This thing is now coherent. This is a coherent picture. Because what I had was atomistic. I could interpret for your fiqh, I could give you kalam and so on, but it didn't have the coherentist kind of vision. So that was Fazlur Rahman. So in some ways, he rescues me. He rescues me. He's al-munqidh. Al-munqidh is the rescuer from, well, I wouldn't say dalal, but the rescuer from disenchantment. Disenchantment. I became disenchanted with the tradition. But as I engage more and more with Rahman, I really find him helpful to get me into a kind of what I would call is a kind of a neo-Salafist mode. Because Rahman finally, so Rahman has Fazlur Rahman has a very complex biography. And also a complex man himself. And his intellectual biography is complex. So his father is a graduate from Deoband School. His father is a student of a grandee of the Deoband School, Mahmud al-Hasan. And Mahmud al-Hasan is a very big figure, but very influential figure, political actor, activist, but also a very thoughtful person. I just give you one sliver of insight on Mahmud al-Hasan. You might even write his name down. He's also named as Sheikh al-Hind. For instance, a sliver of his thing is that I think there was a controversy in India at a particular time about people writing things against the Prophet. I don't know if he was responding to that or not, but he said something to the effect. He said that often you guys want to defend the Prophet, and this came a lot to my mind in the light of this cartoon stuff, in the light of this innocence of Muhammad thing, and how Muslims were immolating themselves. I could not get it, and the kind of self-destruction that was happening, and before on the Quran and all kind of really troubles me deeply. Is that Mahmud al-Hasan says that oftentimes you think that you are defending the Prophet, but you should ask the question whether you are not defending your collective ego. Are you really defending the Prophet? Or is your collective ego wounded? I was blown away. I was totally blown away by this. This is a major insight by a traditional Muslim thinker. Major insight. To just give you a highlight of what Mahmud al-Hasan is about. So Fazl Rahman's father, Shihabuddin, studied with Mahmud al-Hasan. Is a Deobandi. What's her name? Fazl Rahman studies at Lahore University in Arabic and Persian. He studies the traditional curriculum with his father. Two people were regular visitors with his father. One is a man called Abul Ala Maududi. Can you write the name down? Most people know Abul Ala Maududi, and Maududi used to be Maududi used to lecture at his father's mosque from time to time, give the sermon. Another man was Ubaidullah Sindhi. Was also a disciple of Mahmud al-Hasan. And Ubaidullah Sindhi was the kind of major political activist who did the work for Mahmud al-Hasan and the political operations against the British. He went to Russia. From Russia, he spent time in Istanbul and then in the Hijaz. And the major inspiration for Ubaidullah Sindhi was Shah Waliullah. Ubaidullah Sindhi writes elaborate commentary on Waliullah's book that I just cited from. For him, that is the kind of Waliullah for Ubaidullah Sindhi, Waliullah's book is like his Rousseau for many. That is his Rousseau. And in fact, Jacques Berck, the French writer, the French Islamologist, Jacques Berck, who died, Jacques Berck also said that Shah Waliullah was like the Indian Rousseau, who thinks about these issues in the broad, big picture and so on. Ubaidullah Sindhi, when he used to visit Shah Waliullah, Fazl Rahman's father, Ubaidullah Sindhi was very troubled by Fazl Rahman's father's, whose name is Shihabuddin's conservatism. And he always said, Shihabuddin, your son is going to execute you. In other words, your son is going to execute your conservatism. He's going to, tumhara beta tumhara qatl karega. Your son is going to kill you. Okay, he's going to. So it was said in jest that intellectual. What's his name? So Fazl Rahman then from there goes to Cambridge, Oxford, and works with Simon van der Berg, and does the work on I'm just checking how many of you are sleeping, and Kitab al-Najat of Ibn Sina. It's a book on the psychology of Ibn Sina. He then translates that, gets a job at Durham University here, and then from Durham he goes to McGill. From McGill he's recalled to Pakistan by Ayub Khan because they're going through kind of making Islamic legislation, making legislation of Pakistan compliant to Islamic norms. They formed the Center for Islamic Research. He's very active, very busy there, and so on and so forth. But soon he comes under fire by two audiences, some of the ulama he'd been collaborating with, like Taqi Usmani's father, Mufti Shafi. He collaborated with him. Mufti Shafi gave some fatwas on how chicken should be slaughtered, with machine slaughtered chicken. He said it was okay. We pressed the button. Once Fazlur Rahman issued that ruling and made it available, and Mufti Shafi, other people criticized it, Mufti Shafi quickly withdrew the fatwa, said, well, it's not on, and so but then his book Islam came out, and that 2 lines became the basis of a whole lot of uproar and and members of the Jamaat Islami were on his case too, and there were protests, and Fazlur Rahman at some point felt that the government of Pakistan was not interested in this stuff, and they were only playing a game. So he exited from there, went to UCLA in California for about 18 months, and he got a job at Chicago, and then he stayed. I only met Fazlur Rahman once, a memorable conversation that we had at the time, and I edited that book of his that left incompleted, and so on. But what Fazlur Rahman gave me at a particular time was a handle on how to understand the Quran, and also that a certain amount of vigilance of how you treat hadith and how to read hadith. So he's been criticized in his hadith reading that he has become too much of an agnostic and skeptic because of the influence of people like Gulzih and Shaht and the Orientalists. Because the Orientalists do put the hadith through a rigorous critical Nietzschean historiography of a hermeneutic of suspicion. That, why does the Prophet say so, and what kind of work does this hadith do, and why are there so many Abu Hurairas, and why are there hadith that say, why are there hadith that say, I don't want to see you guys leaning on cushions and saying, I don't accept anything but the Quran, right? And other people saying, well, you have to accept the hadith that says pro-hadith. So Fazlur Rahman said they are pro-Quran hadith and pro-hadith hadith, and he writes a kind of historiography, but I think it's one of his more insightful works, largely neglected, of a kind of someone who's trying to put together a kind of a new kind of historiography in reading the hadith, and to see what kind of work the hadith does. More than saying this is what the Prophet said, but what kind of work the hadith does. And if we connect that to what Muhammad Arkoon says, that you have to think about hadith as the archive of Muslim memory, of how Muslims imagined the Prophet said, how the Prophet did, how Muslim norms came through over time. More than just rejecting the hadith is a false hadith or fabricated hadith and so on. Think of the hadith, how Muslims grappled with the legacy. It's an archive of Muslim cultural memory that I got from Arkoon. So I think, but don't abandon the hadith, but think of how Muslim imagined over time. But the mainstream Muslim Orthodox tradition basically sees hadith as a normative tradition. Hadith gives you norms, and they're only interested in norms. The story part of hadith, the moral stories, the ethical stories of hadith, largely gets neglected. But it comes up in sermons and so on that the Prophet said and so on, but no enlargement about it, right? So you get the sermon of, the sermons would talk about the hadith that 3 men were caught in a rock, behind a rock, and the rock closed up, and each one then said, God, I had this opportunity to sin and I didn't sin, and and the rock opens up a little bit and so on. This kind of moral stories and so on. But not enough of that moral stories are made. We make a big deal out of that moral stories. What we are all interested in, but this kind of do's and don'ts and regulations, right? We're not interested too much in the ethical stuff. And I think that's a huge neglect. It's a huge deficit, in what's in it. We've completely neglected the akhlaqi tradition, the ethics, the adab and akhlaq tradition, and we have overcompensated on the fiqh tradition and do's and don'ts. And we've actually fiqhized the Quran also. So the fiqhization of the Quran. Okay, so the Quran has been made into a fiqh document and so on, rather than the big picture of opening you up to the glory of God. That's missing. And we become, as I said earlier, and I say explicitly, we become worshippers of the Quran. We're worshippers of text rather than worshippers of God. Now, people might find that provocative or confusing or whatever the case may be. I'm happy to engage further discussion. So Fazlur Rahman, back to Fazlur Rahman. So Fazlur Rahman's major contribution in this book, Islamic Modernity, and other work that he did, was that he said that we need to see the Quran in historical context, and what the ahkam verses, the verses about the rules and regulations, what kind of work they did, And he's being a very traditional Muslim jurist. And we need to see what the ratio legis was, what the reason was that the rule was revealed there. And once you get the ratio legis and so on, you can see how the rule gets applied. And but now he goes beyond applied, where the traditional faqih would just say the hukam is yes or no. He says, let's extrapolate the value. What is the underlying value? Is the underlying value justice? Is it compassion? It is beauty? Get the value out of this. So once you can extrapolate the values, then you can move those values over time and drop it into our context. So then you have continuity. So that is what we call axiology. Yahya, can you put that down? Axiology. That axiology is about kind of values, the way we talk about values. Ismail Faruqi was also big interested in this. I just wish Ismail Faruqi stayed with axiological discussions. He went on to with this whole thing of Islamization and so on. But he was one of the first people that started talking about axiological discussions about how does one talk about value talk? How does one develop values? Fazlur Rahman was basically struggling with Quranic values about the ahkam versus, I don't think he had enough time to talk about, get into the adab and ethical literature where you could now talk about more values and how these Quranic values would talk to the larger traditional values and so on. There could have been a much more robust and complex story, and life didn't allow him that amount of time to do. But that's what he tries to do. Now, I've later become a little bit critical of Fazlur Rahman on this question of this extrapolation of value, because I think it is a little bit of a kind of an artificial thing. It's instrumentalizing. It's instrumentalizing the Quran. But in that way, he is just as instrumentalist with the Quran as the faqih is, and as the modern Salafi is. Both instrumentalize the Quran, all of them. And Fazlur Rahman's big problem was that he could not get to terms with Hans-Georg Gadamer's work. Gadamer talked about truth and method, that it is about hermeneutical method. It's about interpretation, and the interpretation involves both the interpreter and the text. There's the horizon of the text and there's the horizon of the interpreter, and you meet somewhere in the interpretation. Fazlur Rahman was more interested in the kind of objective value of the Quranic value. At the same time, he was also trying to be an Islamic reformer, and he wanted to improve the status of women. So he had to do a whole lot of intellectual gymnastics to get around of talking about equality for Muslim women, where there are verses that are clearly saying that men are the maintainers of women, وَلِلْرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, and men have an edge over women. You can't extrapolate equality from that. It's all. So in some ways, Fazlur Rahman tried to get away with value and say values, but you're not going to find equality in the Quran. That's a very different ballgame. Gender equality is not in the Quran, not even the Hadith. That is your world, our world that now has brought this thing. And in some ways, I find that kind of approach to a little bit kind of infantilizing, because it makes you continuously dependent on some text that must give you the guidance. You're always dependent on text. It's kind of text dependency. That you cannot do anything unless the Quran tells you anything. That's problematic. You have to find everything in the Quran or in the Hadith. No. The way I understand tradition, and that's the tradition sets the ball going, starts the game. And everybody then writes a different chapter of the novel. So it's a continuous novel. Everybody writes a different chapter. Every generation writes its chapter. There's both continuity and discontinuity, because some characters you had in this chapter will not appear in chapter 2, but might re-emerge in a different form in chapter 5. But there's, so it's what we call a novel chapter written by different people. But so Fazlur Rahman was this idea that he wanted to do this kind of objectivist work. So therefore he preferred, as he said in this book, the work of the Italian jurist Emilio Betti, who gave him more kind of legal instrumentalist understanding of values and so on. But if I want to take the Rahmanian project further, I would say that let's go with values. Let's go with value talk. But then I need a much more bigger, texture, I need a much more bigger template, I need much more bigger resources to do value talk. And one of the things I think Fazl Rahman did not address, but Iqbal addresses, even though he's a great admirer of Iqbal, he's also critical of Iqbal in some places because he thinks that Iqbal on the women question becomes an apologetic, engaged in apologetics, is that when you're doing, there's my notes, I had some notes on this, that when you're doing value talk and conversation about values, so let me just take one big point of from Islam and modernity. Fazl Rahman says that so Fazl Rahman said that religio-moral values cannot be mere postulates to be believed in. He says that on page 14. And he says that God is the transcendent and anchoring point of attributes such as life, creativity, power, mercy, and justice, including retribution, and of moral values to which a human society must be subject if it is to survive and prosper, a ceaseless struggle for the cause of the good. This constant struggle is the keynote of man's normative existence and constitutes the service, ibadah, to God with which the Quran squarely, inexorably charges him. We're all on the same page here. It's about adoration of God. How do you adore God? How do you serve God? Through the world. But the substantive or constitutive, as Kantian phraseology would have it, the constitutive teaching of the Prophet and the Quran is undoubtedly for action in this world, since it provides guidance for man concerning his behavior on earth in relation to other men. God exists in the mind of the believer to regulate his behavior if he is religio-morally experienced. But that which is to be regulated is the essence of the matter. That which is to be regulated is the essence of the matter. What you must regulate, what you must order, what you must find the system for. The bane, that is the downfall of later medieval Islam, as we shall presently see, he says, was that what was regulative, namely God, was made the exclusive object of experience, and thus instead of men seeking values from this experience, the experience became the end in itself. In other words, you're just feeling really cool about the high you get in experience God. He's particularly critical of the Sufis here, right? You get this high, and you just want to stay in this high, but you're now glorifying the experience in itself. But this experience in itself has to be placed into a regulative order. You need to put it to work in terms of norms and values of compassion, of goodness, of kindness, all this kind of stuff. That's what he thinks that is missing. And that's also, I'll later talk about Ghazali, does a similar kind of criticism about the Muslim jurist. What Fazl Rahman, so he makes that claim, but he gets stuck on the whole question of values talk, and he doesn't offer us, in my view, respectfully, and I love him a great deal, is that he doesn't offer us the kind of epistemological foundation, the knowledge grounds of how do I make the regulations. How do I make it? Now, if I want to be charitable to him, if I want to say, well, maybe he implies that Kant and Ghazali and Hegel and Ibn Rushd are all my heritage. And from there I need to put together the epistemological framework. Right? So that's where we need to put the epistemological framework. That is your knowledge grounds. So you need to work the knowledge grounds and so on. I wish he said it explicitly. This is what I think he's implying, and that is where I go with my work. For me, it is Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, it's Aristotle and Ibn Arabi. It's all of that. It could be Kautilya, it could also be from, Lao Tse. All kinds of forms of wisdom is my heritage. I can be as intellectually promiscuous as possible. For me, that is the kind of thing to put it together and to make it work for me. That is where Fazlur Rahman is going. We're on the same page. If that is where he's going, that is why what he's implying that you have to. And because he doesn't say anything about it, how you put this together. The problem is, as much as Muslim orthodoxy and Muslim traditionalism, whether it's Al-Azhar or Deoband or Barelvi or Salafis, wherever they are not open to the idea that knowledge produced by Kant and Rousseau and Hegel can in any way be part of an epistemology in which engages the Muslim tradition. They just think that that knowledge tradition is so shot through with skepticism and atheistic claims that they think it is completely forbidden. And most recently, Mufti Taqi Usmani said it very explicitly in a text that I can cite to you. And whereas in fact, Hegel was a deeply religious man. Hegel was deep religious. These people are all theologians. They were struggling with their Christianity in a world that is changing. They're like Muhammad Abdu, all our Muslim thinkers. We all thinking Muslims struggle with their faith claims and their historical theologies in a altering world, and how does it work? So each one resolved in different ways. So that is Fazlur Rahman, and of course, what I kind of find problematic with Fazlur Rahman is that the stuff that he really was good at, the philosophy of Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadra, he wrote beautifully about that. He never brings that back to work in creating this kind of epistemological framework that would be robust. At the end of the day, he is a kind of Salafi / modernist who is kind of Quran-centered hermeneutics. Everything is centered on the Quran and that part of the hadith that works with the Quran, and that's it. That's the only thing that's going to work. And in that way, I think he takes his signal from a version of Iqbal. Because that's what Iqbal also says, at the end of the day, it's the Quran. But Iqbal also opens up other doors. He talks about tradition. He talks about remaking the tradition, re-narrating the tradition. But sometimes Iqbal also overstates. And you must also know that Iqbal sometimes says things in hyperbole. So one time you read Iqbal and you think, oh my God, he hates the West. And next time you read Iqbal, he says, you stupid Muslim, you're not looking at what people are doing in the West. That's how Iqbal talks to you, right? So Iqbal is to kind of criticize the Muslims, and he criticizes the West, and he does all kinds of things and so on. So you can't just have a singular reading of Iqbal. So coming back to Fazlur Rahman and his methodology, so finally he pushes this kind of Quran-centered interpretation. Everything is centered on the Quran, which is not actually a new thing, because in my recent reading of Ghazali, in a text that I'll talk about later on, Ghazali does talk about some schools that only think about the Quran. He creates a hierarchy of 5 taxonomies and says some people only talk about the Quran. So this is not new. There were precedents to that of people who were a little bit skeptical about the provenance of hadith and so on. But I think you lose a lot of Muslim meat and texture if you throw away the hadith. You lose a lot. You just don't have then you have a tradition without a memory. You just have a name, but you don't have memory. The hadith is fascinating. The corpus of writings of Muslims and their writings and how they imagine, should never be lost. We should preserve those stuff and study those materials of how Muslims imagine their world, the fuqaha, the jurists, the Quran interpreters. That very little work has been done on that, and I sometimes fear that very little work is going to be done by that, except because every Muslim wants to become an engineer and an engineer and an engineer. And who is going to be our interpreters and scholars and so on and so forth. And the thing that really blows my mind is that some of these engineers start interpreting the Quran. Oh my God, it's like bridge building, man. They just do this kind of, they don't understand humanistic thinking is different from this kind of mechanical thinking. So a whole body of our thinking, thank you, is mechanistic. And thank you. So it's a very mechanistic thinking that goes on, whereas humanistic thinking is poetic thinking. It's about thinking with multiple dimensions, keeping many things in line. So that's the big difference. Why some people might be not on the same page, and hopefully you'll have enough to think about for the next couple of days, and maybe some of the things that I'm saying might hit a chord or might not hit a chord. I cannot vouch for any of those stuff, but what I'm trying to say is that, you know, listen with an open mind and read more novels, read more philosophy, and read more poetry, and that's also how you cultivate a particular sensibility, because these sensibilities just cannot drop out of the air. You have to cultivate that. Look, if you study pharmacology and science and so on, your neuroplasticity is formulated according to a certain kind of template. You think of the world in a particular, come on, that's true. And the humanist, his or her mind is formed according to a particular kind of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity has been there. What I think that these kind of things that the Quran and the tradition talks about requires a very strong sensibility about human feeling and emotion, about relation of the sublime, which cannot be engineered. It's a dhawq, it's a taste that you develop, it's cultivated. And the crisis in Muslim contemporary thought is all these engineers are becoming the interpreters of the Quran, from Shahrur to the MB folks in Cairo, and they want to implement the Sharia and those kind of stuff, from folks in Pakistan who don't have a deep knowledge of the tradition, but they want to become authorities of tradition, from the folks in Kelantan and Aceh and those places. I mean, they're just doing all kinds of stuff, right? It's not deep. It's not deep. So we are. Those folks are skating on very thin ice. It's only the nas. They run on the nas. They got rollerblades with nas on it. So it's just running with and just running with the nas, with the text, without thinking. So I'm sorry, I'm kind of provocative and something, hopefully not offensive. So that's where we are with Fazlur Rahman, that he didn't provide us a good landscape for how to do the epistemological work. But I think if he implies that, then I'm with him, and I'm hoping that I'm contributing some of that in my work, because I take the Islamic and the Western tradition, both of them, very seriously, to the extent that I know and work with a few thinkers in trying to begin to do what Gayatri Spivak called the kind of invisible mending of the tradition. You know, invisible mending, when you used to break, when your garment has a rent in it and it's broken. In the olden days, nowadays people just throw it away, but you go to a tailor and they do rafu. They do invisible mending. They take the threads on this side and threads on that side, and then they put new threads and they make it look nice. So our intellectual tradition has been torn asunder by the colonial and Western episteme in various ways. So Muslims have now been made in a different kind of self too. We have multiple selves. Huge amount of disenchantment with the West. Even Muslims living in the West are more disenchanted about the West than Muslims living outside the West, right? We know that. And we're all the time fighting and so on. So that's another thing. And that's our own kind of pathologies that we have to deal with. But Fazlur Rahman is giving us some kind of guidance. Iqbal basically was a big kind of Bergsonian, and Iqbal followed, a big influence of Iqbal was Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. So, and he said that, each philosopher, Bergson had this to say, that each philosopher has only one great thing to say. And Iqbal also had one great thing to say, and his thing was to, and in fact, Iqbal met Bergson in Paris, I believe. So for Iqbal, the big thing that Iqbal said, he wrote on poetry, philosophy, and politics, but he had a single preoccupation, and that was khudi, self, and selfhood. For Iqbal, is all about selfhood. And his was a reflexive notion of the self, one caught between the security of tradition and the self-questioning impulses of modernity. To question or alter the self has had multiple cultural and philosophical iterations. it remains the issue that preoccupies both individuals and societies in the modern age. For most of the 20th century, thinkers in the religion, philosophy, literature, indeed nearly all scholars in the human sciences, social, and even in natural sciences, have spilt a good amount of ink on the subject of the human self. And I'm not going to go into the biography of Iqbal, but reconstruction is kind of the major text. And let me just tell you, it's a very complex understanding of what the idea of the self is. But so Iqbal takes this idea of self, which was as the kind of the moral and religious ideal of man. But what he does, he takes the idea of khudi that occurs in Persian, that had a very different meaning in the Persian tradition. So in Persian poetics, khudi had a negative meaning of selfishness and egotism. In Persian poetics, the idea of khudi meant selfishness and egotism. Iqbal revamps that idea, and he subverts it to an affirmative and constructive rendering by tethering khudi to society, self and society. And then he redeploys khudi in multiple uses and multiple forms, making it the centerpiece of both his poetic and his political aesthetics. So khudi tells us that the moral and religious ideal of man, as R.A. Nicholson explained, is not khudi, the moral and the religious ideal of man is not self-negation, but self-affirmation. Not self-negation, but self-affirmation. And he attains this ideal by becoming more and more individual and more unique. Talha, you get your answers? Are you listening carefully? This selfhood is a metaphysical force field. Attained at the interstices of the human and the divine. The human and divine, the meeting point. That's where the self is constructed. As part of Iqbal's metaphysical panoply, khudi arouses the mythopoetic stratum in culture. Culture has mythos, power, energy, imagination within its culture. And that's what Iqbal thinks, that khudi arouses that mythopoetic. So he, for instance, he uses the idea of Jamshed, the great king, who can see through his goblet, knowledge of the world. Iqbal uses all kinds of metaphors and so on to make human beings understand, to overcome their limitations. Here the categories of true and untrue are inapplicable, since khudi in Iqbal's usage refers to a non-empirical reality. And khudi, as part of a new metaphysical constellation, becomes, in the word of Leszek Kolakowski, in the context of myth, refers intentionally to non-empirical, unconditioned reality. And this non-empirical, unconditioned reality, metaphysics is that. This non-empirical, unconditioned reality. And as an organ of culture, metaphysics is an extension of humanity's mythical core that, according to Kolakowski, characterizes the concern with the absolutely primal conditions of the realm of experience. They concern the quality of being, of wujud, as whole, as distinct from object. They concern the necessity of events. So it was Iqbal's genius that he managed to invent a metaphysical or mythical construct out of poetics while remaining firmly anchored in the poetic. And let me just conclude now. Under the cover of his poetry, Iqbal is perhaps more explicit about his philosophical aspirations and ambitions for reconstruction. And a very good collection of the Psalms of Persia, Zabur-e-Ajam. Iqbal invites his readers to join him in a journey of revolutionary changes in the world of thought and action. In one poem, he makes reference to two crucial references in Islamic and Persian mythopoesis. The first is a Quranic reference to two worlds: the imperceptible world and the perceptible world. Both equate to the previously mentioned, the perceptible world is the conditioned reality. But the imperceptible world is the unconditioned reality, the metaphysical, unconditioned. That's where you get your energy from. The second is an allusion to the world-revealing cup. The world-revealing cup used by Jamshed, the legendary king of ancient Persia, similar to Alexander the Great's mirror. It was a cup of clairvoyance that allowed the king to see all the events around the world. As Mustansir Mir, a gifted translator and commentator of Iqbal's poems, explains, the implied contrast was for Iqbal's own and more capacious wine pitcher. So Iqbal talks about his wine, he doesn't have a goblet. Iqbal says, I have a wine pitcher, I have a jug full of wine. So he says his jug full of wine outshines Jamshed's cup. How? Jamshed's cup signified power and privilege. By contrast, Iqbal wished to share his entire pitcher, his entire jug, not only a cup full, but he wanted to share his entire jug with the world. Not only with this world, but also with the other world. For while Jamshed could only gaze on the material world, Iqbal's project was to reflect on, to open up both the seen and the unseen world, the conditioned and unconditioned reality. And I conclude when he says, and this poem is deeply moving. He says that both worlds may be seen in the wine pitcher I have. Where is the eye to view the sights I see? There will come another man, possessed, Nietzsche. He's deeply inflected by Nietzsche. There will come another man possessed, who will shout, who? He, in the city. There will come another man possessed, who will shout, he, in the city. 200 commotions will arise from the obsession I have. Do not worry, ignorant man, at the approaching darkness of nights, for the scar of my forehead sparkles like stars. You take me as your companion, but I am afraid that you are not up to the tumult and uproar I have raised. And then he says, and this is also more, he says, God has lost us. God has lost us. He is in search of us. God has lost us. He is in search of us. Like us, he feels need and is captive of desire. Like us, he feels need and he's captive of desire. He wants to be desired. He wants to be loved. At times he inscribes his message in the petals of tulips. At times he makes ecstatic chant in the breasts of birds. He reposes in the narcissus that he may view our beauty. He is so adept at wooing, he's like a lover, he woos us, that his looks make conversation. The sigh he draws at dawn in separation from us are inside and outside, above and below, all around. He has caused all this stir that he might observe the creature of dust. The pageant of scent and color is but a pretext for watching. He is hidden in every particle and yet is a stranger. He is hidden in every particle and yet is a stranger. He is conspicuous like the moon and is caressed by town and street. In this dust bowl of ours is lost the pearl of life. This dust bowl, this world is a dust bowl, he says. This lost pearl, in this dust bowl is lost the pearl of life. This lost pearl, is it we or is it he? This lost pearl, is it he, or is it, sorry, this lost pearl, is it we, or is it he? So that's how Iqbal inspires us to think about the divine in embrace of the world. And I think in that way, if one reads Iqbal and Fazl Rahman and this project of the Rahmanian project that I think should get legs and epistemological legs, and I'm hoping I'm contributing to that and so on, that's where I think that we should be going. Thank you. So, how many of you had a chance to read this? Okay. Yeah, thank you. Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination. Not that you should. I mean, this book, it'll give you a huge headache. But the reason many years ago, when I was trying to do my PhD at the University of Cape Town, I called Muhammad Arkoon. I had two topics in mind. I thought I wanted to do something about Fazl Rahman. And I thought I could do a dissertation on Fazl Rahman. Now Omar is doing it, so that's great. And lots of other people have done work on that, on Fazl Rahman. And I also had, I was reading Ghazali. I was a kind of a deputy imam at a mosque. I know some of you will be surprised that I could be an imam with these kinds of views. What kind of way is he going to take you? No, but I did every second Friday I used to give khutbah, and my qiraat is right up there, don't worry. I'm sure I can still put a few of you out of business. So I'm only kidding. So I was also, one of the ways that I was beginning to, so when you thinking about writing a Friday sermon, you're trying to say, what can I say, something substantive and so on. And I started reading Ghazali, Ihya Ulumuddin. So many years ago, I tried to read Ihya Ulumuddin, a translated version of it, when I was a student in India, and much of it was incomprehensible. I just didn't get it, okay? And it was a translated version and so on. So I started seeing, this guy's got interesting things to say. Every time it's a new discovery. So I phoned Arkoon in Paris, and I said, I'm really between and betwixt. Should I do my dissertation on Fazl Rahman, or should I do it on Ghazali? So Arkoon, in his kind of francophone accent, said, you should study Ghazali, it's more richer. It's richer. He's got his French accent. He says, it's much more richer. Do Ghazali. So I started looking at Ghazali and Ghazali's Usul al-Fiqh, and how does he connect law and theology. Started kind of a lifelong project. And the more I started reading this man, I discovered that this guy is taking from a variety of sources, especially the Ihya Ulumuddin, the resuscitation of the knowledges of tradition, knowledge of the deen, of the deen, ulum ad-din, the ulum of deen, the resuscitation of that. I said, my God, he's taking the hadith from here, verse of the Quran, an example of somebody in the Islamic past, some wisdom literature, and he puts it together and structures a new narrative, right? Structures a new narrative, but an engaging and an energizing narrative. And his big project is that he says that, he rewrites the understanding, what is knowledge, what is fiqh. And he says that, all of fiqh, what we call these practices, do's and don'ts, that fiqh is all about, it's about ilmu tariq al-akhirah. It's the knowledge of finding the way to the hereafter. So it's part of salvation practice. But also at another hand, so that for him is real fiqh. Fiqh is about acts of salvation. And then he also condemns the jurists who said who are only interested in power play, and they're only interested in being trustees of people's inheritance packages and being beneficiaries of trusts and so on. He said that's all they're interested, and they're giving verdicts on marriages, what are permissible and not permissible, and those kind of things. But he says they don't get the real ethical imperative behind these teachings. So he thinks that what went wrong in the tradition was to show the ethical imperatives behind Islamic teachings. So the Ihya Ulumuddin is filled with those kinds of, so the book of love, book of knowledge, book of inner introspection, book of the marvels of the heart, Ajaibul Qalb, lots of these things are now in translation and so on. He begins to unpack those things, and I found it immensely rewarding. But the other thing is that he also thinks that the learning of antiquity, Greek knowledge and so on, is something that he has access to. So he's deeply immersed in logic. And then for his own self, he also studies a lot of philosophy. And he studies the Muslim philosophers. Now, in the study of the Muslim philosophers, Ghazali does get into a bit of a kind of a powwow. He gets into a big fight with the Muslim philosophers. But I think it's a cautionary tale, and we shouldn't overread it nor underestimate it. Because Ghazali has been badly libeled in the whole process. He's been given a bad rap. Maybe sometimes he overstates it. So here's the thing. He finds his major thing with the Muslim philosophers has been, he basically accuses them of stepping outside of creedal orthodoxy on 3 issues. One, they believe that God only knows the universals and God doesn't know the particulars. Secondly, they don't believe in bodily resurrection. And so they believe that resurrection will be, figurative or spiritual rather than bodily. What's the third one? And the third one, they believe that the world is eternal, because they believe that the world emanated, this emanation for you, fail, and not creatio ex nihilo, not created. So on those 3 scores, he says they stepped out, and he flashes the card of takfir. But you see, the card of takfir sometimes is used as a kind of a warning signal not to excommunicate or to anathematize. Takfir is something للتغليظ. التكفير للتغليظ, to show I strongly disagree with you. I wish we could find a better language than do takfir, because I think takfir, I need to translate, right?
No, I know what takfir is. I'm just puzzled that you're saying that takfir doesn't always mean takfir.
Yeah, so takfir doesn't always mean excommunication, but it means pushing you towards it. التكفير للتغليظ, in order to show the vehemence of my opposition. Takfir can signify excommunication, excommunicate you. But it also can show, they say, li al-taghlid, to show, that I strongly disagree, vehement disagreement, and pushing it toward the boundaries of anathematizing and so on. Now, my own view is that we need to find a different kind of language to deal with it, because this pushing out of the boundaries is a big problem. And we go to war with each other, and we kill and destroy, and it just doesn't work for me. But it worked for him, and he started doing that. So he started talking about that. But in a lot of the other stuff that the philosophers did, he was in agreement, and he internalized a lot of philosophy himself. So a lot of his critics said, Al-Ghazali, Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki, a North African who studied with him, says, our master Abu Hamid al-Ghazali swallowed so much philosophy, when he tried to vomit it out, he couldn't get it out. It's just doing it. So he internalized a lot of philosophy himself. And nothing wrong with that. Why could that be wrong? He thinks of that as a part of Islamic heritage, or part of his heritage, that he can take knowledge from whatever source it comes. Now, part of the problem with the philosophers has also been a part of a political problem in the Seljuk period. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt were trying to make inroads into Khurasan and those areas through Fatimid, a certain form of Shiism, Ismaili Shiism that we now call. and they had a particular kind of hierarchy that the da'i or the imam knows everything, and they would engage and win over followers. And so they started seeing that doctrine as a security threat. And my view is that Ghazali thought that the Ismailis were also relying a lot on philosophy, because the brethren of purity, the Ikhwan al-Safa, was one of the mainstay of Ismaili teachings, and they relied a lot on that. So Ghazali relied a lot on, saw that there's a kind of strategic alliance between the Ismailis and the philosophers, so he had to break their backs. There's a political influence. So therefore he had to give some pushback. Some pushback. What he saw was subversive, the subversive dimension of that. But I think the thing that totally infuriates Ghazali, and I begin to appreciate that more increasingly, is that he thinks that the philosophers, and what he's really serious about them and really makes him angry, is that they engage in takdhib al-rasul. Now what is that takdhib al-rasul? In other words, they falsify the message of the Prophet. How? So for instance, there's heaven and hell, right? The philosophers say, well, that's actually meant for the lay people to understand. It's not meant for us smart people. For us smart people, we know it's going to be non-physical. But God had to talk about fire and this kind of stuff and so on, so that lay people, the ordinary people, can understand. That infuriates Ghazali. Because he says, what you're basically doing, you're rewriting the script. You're rewriting the script and subverting the script. Now Ghazali himself also does something like that. Something similar. There's a hadith that says, لا يدخل الملائكة بيتا فيه كلب. Angels do not enter a house in which there's a dog. Ghazali writes a beautiful passage and says, this is about, the dog stands for carnality. And angels don't enter the heart in which there's animality and carnality. That's what it means. A lot of Ghazali's critics jump on him and say, hey, what are you doing here? Why are you just... He said, no. I mean, it can mean this, but it also means the dog thing. The real dog in a house doesn't mean... I'm not denying that. That's his problem with the philosopher. The philosopher said that, look, it could mean, it's possible that the language is ambiguous. Heaven and hell could be physical, it could be figurative, possibilities. He would say, well, we can disagree and we can argue about it. But don't absolutize and say there's only one version of this, and don't go so far as saying that God was doing double speaks. For Ghazali, it was about the integrity. It was about the integrity of religion speaks. It was the integrity of religious discourse that he wanted to maintain. And he also felt that some of the philosophically minded folks were sometimes using their smarts as a way to lord over the religious folks and the theologians, and show people that the theologians know very little or try to intimidate religious folks. So for instance, unfortunately this has been taken completely out of context by Nidal Guesson in his book Islam's Quantum Question and so on. So the section in the Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the deliverance or the rescuer from error, which is his autobiography, he says the mathematicians. He says the mathematicians, many of the mathematicians, they basically, because they are smart people and people admire their mathematical talent, people will then, they also tend out most often, these mathematicians also don't think religion is a good thing. They're kind of agnostic or atheistic and so on. So then, because of the demonstration effect, because these smart people don't take religion seriously, lay people will see, hey, the smartest people don't take religion seriously, we shouldn't take religion seriously either. So Ghazali says, sometimes you need to cut these guys down to size. You need to cut them down to size and say, hey, your authority is only about mathematics. Your authority, because you're smart in math, doesn't mean you're good in theology. Because you're smart in math doesn't mean that you're smart in physics. And he makes the point, he says that, everybody has a speciality. But expertise in one area doesn't make you an expert in another area. These are different kinds of things. So that was his kind of rhetorical pushback. Because you understand, he's fighting a number of forces there. But the very next paragraph he says, you must also be careful of the Muslim jahil, the ignorant Muslim, who thinks that lunar and solar eclipses are some supernatural events. He says, these are normal, natural events that happen. There are laws and rules and regulation. And he said, it's because of such idiots that we have in our midst who talk about these things, that the people, the philosophers and the smart people laugh at religion and they make a mockery out of religion because you have idiots talking about religion. That's what he says. So unfortunately, Nidal Ghusom only quotes the first part of the what's the name, and says even Ghazali. I don't think Ghazali was very much into, but he kept these things in attention, and he was talking back to multiple audiences. He's not anti-science. And Parvez Hoodboy and all those other guys who write about science, they keep on jumping on Ghazali. And the question of causality in Ghazali, Ghazali says that fire doesn't burn cotton. It's because of a habit and custom. People like Hume and other people also talked about these a long time ago. Ghazali preempted them. But if you tell Ghazali, put your hand over the fire, he said, are you out of your mind? You never do that. He's not going to put his hand because he knows it's going to burn. He's talking about teleological causation. He's talking about the philosophical sense of how this stuff works. So it's a highly philosophical debate that unfortunately people misread and misunderstand and libel Ghazali as being what's his name. But I think the key issue that I find in Ghazali that I benefited a tremendous amount from Ghazali was that I found him that he is in the same kind of crisis situation that I am, that he's at the confluence of multiple traditions, the Arabic tradition of his Prophet ﷺ, the tradition of his own society, the Persianate tradition, the tradition of the Greeks that he's also being heir to. And how does he put all these things together? And I think he did a splendid job, and he became the mainstay of the intellectual tradition that Muslims have, and we are still feasting at Ghazali's table because of all the kind of goodies that put on intellectually that it stimulates us and does it. And so one of his works, known as the canon of interpretation, Qanun al-Ta'wil, Ghazali starts off with a how are we doing for time, Yahya?
We've got about 10 minutes.
Okay. So Ghazali starts off and he says things like, there's a hadith. Someone asked him the question that how do you explain the meaning of this hadith? Surely Satan mixes in you the way blood courses in your veins. Inna shaytana yajri fikum majra dam. Inna shaytana yajri fikum majra dam, or something. Satan flows in your veins like blood flows. Now Ghazali spends 16 pages trying to explain, to pass this thing. And it's really something, I've translated it, I need to work on it more, it'll become available at some point. You can see that this guy's not taking this thing literally. He's now saying, okay. So he, in his time, uses his kind of biological stuff and uses different kinds of ways to understand that. So, he is heir to the biological tradition, the way you think about, the four humors, right? Fire, what's the name? Yeah, so it talks about the four humors, al-akhlat al-arba, yellow bile, that stands for fire, black bile, which is equivalent to earth, blood, which is air, phlegm, which is water. And so he says, now, is that what is happening? So he uses the idiom of his time, right? And he uses a different kind of background knowledge to make sense of this tradition. And he goes on and on and on to articulate. Then he goes and makes a taxonomy of 5 groups of people, those who, and he goes into all kind of detail of Arabic similes, where Satan flees when he hears the call to prayer, and then Satan also gets so scared that he emits sounds. You know what I mean, right? He gets so scared that he emits sounds from his rear. That's what it says. Kind of. respectful company. So I'm trying to not use the F word, not the ugly F word, FARTS. And he uses the example. He says that Arabs have a statement said mudarritul hijara, that someone emits in form of air stones, that someone is so harsh you grind stones with your hardness, interior hardness and so on. So he goes through a whole range of then he raises the question. He said, talk about the barzakh, the isthmus, the in-between place. What is that? Are they destined for paradise? Are they destined for hell? Some people say this, some people say that. He gives all kinds of different kinds of interpretations. What is the pool in the afterlife, the hawd in the afterlife on the Day of Judgment? What is it meaning? Where is it located? He's trying to interpret this thing, but he now makes a whole range of articulations of similar kinds of statements about the pool on the Day of Judgment, right? And where is that located? How does it mean? How do we explain it? How do we mean it? And so on. And then his answer is that, he says, I detest giving an answer to some of these several reasons. But, in order to solve the question, I'm going to give you a kind of a general rule of thumb. So first he shows that I really don't want to get into this, but just to solve the problem, I'm going to give you a qanun kulli on this and so on. So he says, on the first blush, he says, there seems to be a collision between reason and revelation on the one hand, and reason and revelation. And then he says, those who delve in these matters are divided into 5 groups. The first, can you make it a note on that? The first group are those who group 1, excessive and exclusive reliance on revelation. That's group 1. Group 2 are those who exclusively rely on reason. That's group 2, on the reason. And then he says then there's the third group, the moderates who combine both. But now you have 3A.
Oh, I've got 4 here.
Okay, no, but okay. So make it 4.
Yeah.
Okay, so so the third are the moderates who make reason the grounds for interpretation and relegate revelation to be ancillary to it.
So hang on a minute.
So you have moderates who try to combine both.
Yeah, I've just
But
got, R and R.
combine both. But stick to number 3. But stick to number 3.
Okay.
Take away number 4. Put another coda to number 3,
Okay.
and that is that they make reason the grounds for reason is the grounds, reason is prior, and the revelation is ancillary to it, and therefore they lack meticulous inquiry into the complex meanings of revelation. Okay, Pardon me? Qanun al-Ta'wil, canon of interpretation. Pardon me? I can't hear you. I got my own translation. This thing is not translated yet. This is my translation of it. So you'll have to get it from me. Now you go to number 4. The fourth are moderate. These moderates who combine R and R, right?
Yeah.
So fourth are moderates who make revelation the grounds for interpretation. Revelation is prior, and they relegate reason to be ancillary to it. Reason is ancillary. And therefore they also lack meticulousness in reason. They don't make fully fledged inquiries into rationality and reason, so they lack meticulousness in reason. And so now you know the 5th group, right? So the 5th group, you can work it out, are those who make each revelation and reason a foundation. And are you by number 5 yet? Not yet.
Let's put 5 those who do justice to both, yeah.
Just do both, but they do both, and they make revelation. Each one, both reason and revelation are each a foundation, and they don't shortchange any one of them, right? So reason and revelation, both are not shortchanged, and they try to combine and reconcile between the two. So there's reconciliation between reason and revelation. So then he goes on and he elaborates on all of these things in great detail. What he ends up doing, and I'm not going to give you all the details now, but he's basically saying that when you do so, and I find this to be the most powerful outcome of that, is that he creates what I call a triangular hermeneutic. I think it's a triangular hermeneutic. Hermeneutic means method of interpretation. Hermeneutic is so what you'll see when you go through this thing, Ghazali is not only about this hadith that that Satan mixes in your blood. Satan mixes in you the way blood flows in your veins or blood courses in your veins. He doesn't just deal with this thing. He sees that as a package of interpretive processes, and he needs to connect it and create deep background statements. There are other statements that are analogous to those things, and he needs to package it and so on. And in all of those things, he says three things. And I put it as a kind of, that he keeps this in a triangular fashion because they are all into tension they are in tension with each other. So the first thing he says, one should not aspire to grasp all of these complexities. Don't aspire to grasp all of these. In other words, don't think that you can know all. Don't think you can grasp all. Can grasp all. In other words, this is a kind of one of the legs of this hermeneutic is a leg of modesty. That there's only so much that you can know, and you're going to kind of get stuck if you're trying to be absolute knowing all stuff. So you need to be, this is how much I know right now, and this is how much I can grasp, and I might not, but you're open to the idea that I might not have captured all. So you're always saying that there is a space for my ignorance, right? Second thing is one should not, as a matter of principle, don't refute reason. As a matter of principle, don't refute reason. So don't think you can get all, don't refute reason.
What might refuting reason look like?
In other words, don't say that the lunar and solar eclipses are some kind of supernatural thing that happened. You can see that reason tells you how this thing works. 1 and 1 is 2. I know common sense a priori stuff that you need to give cognizance to that. The third thing he says is that and while we're there, he says the reason he says if you deny reason, you might also deny religion, because he says religion is based on a certain cognition and certain kind of understanding of is based on rationality, a certain amount. Without that, you can't talk about the religion. You cannot even talk about religion. The third piece of dimension, he says, is that if there is, when there is ambiguity, when something has multiple meanings, when there are multiple meanings, when there's multiple meanings, so text and words are open to multiple interpretations, don't insist on one. Don't insist on one. Don't lock it down to one is absolutely right and all the others are wrong. Because they are open to plurality, you must keep the plurality alive. Keep the plurality of interpretation in life. So you can say, yeah, I prefer this for the following reasons, and you go ahead with it and so on. But don't go into denialism of the others. You can have a robust discussion and so on, but you cannot say this is absolutely right. So in this way, I think Ghazali teaches me, and a lot of these things, is a very powerful way that you have to keep all these tensions in, you must keep these tensions alive. The humility dimension, don't deny your rational component, and don't become an absolutist at the same time. I find it very powerful and very illuminating, and I think it will take us, a great distance in trying to understand many of the kind of issues that we have.
Just a point of clarification, would you extend that to mean any hermeneutical tool? Reason in particular, or any form of controlled thought, or do you see what I mean? Any form of controlled reasoning or thought or hermeneutical tool?
Yeah, I'm just using the bare outlines, but I would widen this when I'm going to write about this in greater detail and greater reflection. I'm going to widen this.
Right, okay.
I think it gives you a lot of play, right?
Okay.
This also gives me a lot of kind of that. And the thing he says language. He says language is all the time open to reinterpretation. توسعا. توسع في اللغة. And the language of the Arabs, he says, is semiotically and semantically rich, and it's open to different kinds of meanings and so on. So you cannot shut it down. Pardon me? In this book. Yeah, Qanun Tawil, that it's semantically توسعا في اللغة. In the language of the Arabs, he says, let me give you the quote. But there is an abundance of possibilities for multiple interpretive perspectives for ambivalent meanings in the Arabic speech and in its inordinate flexibility. Are you hearing it, brother? But when those interpretations are limited, then suspending judgment in interpretation But when these interpretations are limited, then suspending judgment in interpretation is the safest. For example, when it becomes clear to you that deeds are not literally weighed on the Day of Judgment, yet in the prophetic report it is stated that deeds are weighed. In that situation, you have the word weigh and you have the word deed. It is possible that the word deed could be figurative. The term deed is used metonomically, as kinayatan, as a metonymy, as the book of deeds, okay, which is the place where deeds are kept until they are weighed with all the books of deeds. But it is possible that weight be the figurative, but you can also say that no, deed is not figurative, weight is figurative. That is majaz. Or that the word weight is interpreted and not deed. In any of this, if any of this is accomplished without any attention to reason or the authority of tradition, then such a person has speculatively made a judgment on God and God's intention. Now here's the thing. He says in many of these kind of teachings, when it comes to amal, when it comes to actions, practices, zakat, fasting, those kind of stuff, he says in those areas, dhanni, what we call probable judgments, are fine. But when it comes to creedal stuff, in creedal stuff you must have qat'i, you must have certainty. Now he says, the certainty is where? Is the certainty in the details or is the certainty in the headlines? So he says what we are required in terms of certainty is to have only in the iman mujmal, in the synoptic creed. That's where you have to have certainty. Yes, there's going to be heaven and hell. Yes, there is what. That's synoptically. That's where you have qat'i. But the thing is about, but when it comes to the details, he says, we are here in interpretive land. We are in hermeneutical paradise. We have now all kinds of stuff that we need to interpret, and so we cannot be too absolutely certain about that. So I find that the Ghazalian project is very helpful to me. I'm done. And I think that it's some area that I want to further open up, and I want to interpret this whole thing in greater detail with the translation.